A wealthy tech millionaire hired a poor woman to be his girlfriend, but when she spoke at dinner, the symphony of emergency room alarms pierced through the silence of that fateful December night. Dr. Ava Harper's hands, steady after thousands of surgeries, moved with practiced precision as she fought to save the life of 8-year-old Sophie Williams. The child's heart had stopped twice already during what should have been a routine appendectomy. BP dropping, Doctor the nurse called out, her voice tight with tension. Ava's mind raced through possibilities, questioning every decision she'd made in the operating room. Something wasn't right. The child's reaction was too severe for a simple appendicitis case. Previous medical history, Ava demanded, her eyes never leaving the small figure on the table. Nothing unusual noted, just seasonal allergies, another nurse responded, flipping through the charts. The monitors screamed again as Sophie's heart rate plummeted. Ava's world narrowed to this moment, this child, this fight against death itself. She wouldn't lose another patient, not after Thomas Chen last month. Starting cardiac massage, Ava announced, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. Push 1 amp of epinephrine. Minutes stretched like hours as the team worked desperately to stabilize the child. Then, suddenly, an unexpected hemorrhage. Blood seemed to appear from nowhere, defying every protocol, every procedure Ava had followed. She's coding. The next 45 minutes were a blur of desperate measures, failed attempts, and finally the inevitable. Time of death. 11:42 p.m., Ava heard herself say, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Later, as she sat in the hospital administrator's office, the world crashed around her. The investigation revealed traces of a medication in Sophie's system that should never have been there, a medication that, according to the records, Ava had prescribed. "This is impossible," she protested, staring at the documents before her. "I never prescribed this. These aren't my signatures." But the evidence seemed irrefutable. The media descended like vultures, their headlines screaming about negligence and malpractice. Public outrage grew as Sophie's grieving parents appeared on national television, demanding justice. 1 week later, Ava Harper, once the youngest chief of pediatric surgery at Mercy Children's Hospital, stood before the medical board, watching helplessly as her life's work crumbled around her. As they revoked her medical license, she caught a glimpse of Dr. Richard Bennett, the hospital administrator, sharing a knowing look with the elegant woman in the back row. Little did Ava know, this was just the beginning of a story that would unravel everything she thought she knew about truth, justice, and survival. Mason Aldridge stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse office at Aldridge Medical Center, watching the city lights flicker below. At 38, he was the epitome of success, the youngest hospital chain owner in New York's history. But behind the polished exterior lay a story of loss, betrayal, and relentless determination. 15 years ago, the Aldridge family name meant something different. His father, James Aldridge, ran a small but respected private medical practice in Boston, serving 3 generations of families. Mason grew up watching his father treat patients with compassion, often accepting payment in homemade pies or handyman services when families couldn't afford the bills. His mother, Sarah, managed the practice's finances with careful precision, stretching every dollar to put Mason and his younger sister through medical school. Then came the investment opportunity that promised to expand the practice into a small hospital. Emily Winters, Mason's college sweetheart and newly minted investment banker, had convinced the family to invest everything they had. "Trust me," she had said, her green eyes shining with conviction. "This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity." The Aldridges mortgaged their home, emptied their savings, and even borrowed against the practice. But the investment was a sophisticated fraud. Emily disappeared with millions, leaving the Aldridges and dozens of other families financially ruined. The practice collapsed under mounting debts, and their reputation, built over decades, was shattered. Mason had been in his final year of medical school when he received the call. His parents, driving home from another futile meeting with lawyers, had been involved in a fatal car accident. The investigation suggested brake failure, but Mason always suspected there was more to the story. The timing was too convenient, the circumstances too neat. The tragedy forced Mason to drop out of medical school just months before graduation. With debt collectors circling and his teenage sister to support, he took a job as a hospital administrator's assistant. It was there that he discovered his talent for business and healthcare management, working 18-hour days, living in a tiny apartment, and saving every penny. Mason slowly began to rebuild. His first breakthrough came when he identified massive inefficiencies in the hospital's billing system. His proposed solutions saved the hospital millions, earning him a rapid promotion. Within 3 years, he had revolutionized their operations, catching the attention of investors. By 30, he had secured enough backing to purchase his first struggling hospital, turning it profitable within a year. But success came at a price. The bright-eyed medical student who wanted to follow in his father's footsteps had been replaced by a shrewd businessman. Mason built walls around his heart, trusting no one completely. Even his relationship with his sister became strained as she chose to pursue a career in social work rather than join his growing empire. Now, standing in his office at the crown jewel of his achievements, Aldridge Medical Center, Mason was worth billions on paper. The hospital chain he'd built was renowned for its efficiency and cutting-edge treatments. But he never forgot the lessons of his past. Every major decision required his personal review. Every investment was scrutinized mercilessly. Every potential partner was investigated thoroughly. Yet on nights like this, when the weight of his empire felt heaviest, Mason would think about his father's small practice. He remembered the warmth in those worn rooms, the grateful smiles of patients who couldn't pay, the satisfaction in his father's eyes after a long day of helping others. Sometimes he wondered if, in building his fortress of success, he had lost something essential along the way. Little did Mason know that fate was about to force him to confront these questions, as a chance encounter with a disgraced doctor working in a coffee shop would challenge everything he'd built his new life upon. The path ahead would force him to choose between protecting his empire and rediscovering the heart of medicine his father had once embodied. The morning rush at the Corner Cup Cafe buzzed with its usual intensity, but Ava Harper's mind was elsewhere as she crafted another perfect latte. Through the steam of the espresso machine, she caught her reflection in the polished surface, a ghost of the confident surgeon she had been just 6 months ago. At 32, Ava should have been in an operating theater, not behind a coffee counter. She had graduated top of her class at Johns Hopkins, completed her residency at Mayo Clinic, and by 30, had become the youngest chief of pediatric surgery at Mercy Children's Hospital. Her colleagues had called her the child whisperer for her extraordinary ability to calm frightened young patients before surgery. But that was before Sophie Williams, before the accusations, before her whole world imploded. Now, instead of saving lives, Ava worked 3 jobs to keep her brother Tommy alive. The 16-year-old's rare heart condition required expensive medications and constant monitoring. Their parents' insurance had covered most of it until Ava's scandal made national headlines. Now, with her medical license revoked and her reputation in tatters, they'd been dropped from the premium coverage. Between shifts at the cafe, Ava worked as a medical transcriptionist from home and spent weekends helping at a free clinic in the Bronx, under strict supervision and prohibited from treating patients. The clinic's director, Dr. Maria Rodriguez, was one of the few who believed in Ava's innocence, offering her this small connection to the medical world she'd lost. Late at night, after Tommy was asleep, Ava would pore over her brother's medical files, searching for treatment options they could afford. The prestigious Aldridge Medical Center had a promising new cardiac program, but it might as well have been on Mars for all their ability to access it. Besides, After what happened at Mercy, no reputable hospital would touch them. The hardest part wasn't the long hours or the financial strain, it was the loss of purpose. Medicine hadn't been just a career for Ava, it had been her calling. Every time she passed a hospital, her hands would itch for surgical gloves. Every time she heard an ambulance, her heart would race with the instinct to help. Some nights she would dream of Sophie Williams on the operating table, reliving those terrible moments when everything went wrong. She'd wake up drenched in sweat, the questions that haunted her racing through her mind. How had that medication appeared in Sophie's system? Why didn't anyone question the clearly forged signatures? Why had the hospital administration moved so quickly to make her the scapegoat? But during her darkest moments, Tommy would remind her of who she was. "You're still a doctor." Ava, he'd say, his face pale but his spirit unbroken. "They can take away your license, but they can't take away your knowledge or your heart." Those words sustained her as she found ways to help despite her circumstances. She created detailed medical information packets for the free clinic's patients, translating complex conditions into simple terms. She organized medication schedules for elderly neighbors. She even started an anonymous medical advice blog, careful to include disclaimers about consulting licensed physicians. The regulars at the Corner Cup had no idea that the barista who remembered their complex orders and asked about their families had once performed groundbreaking pediatric surgeries. They didn't know that her perfect memory for coffee preferences had once been used to recall complex patient histories and surgical procedures. Only Dr. Rodriguez knew about Ava's silent acts of medical service, the midnight phone consultations with worried parents, the careful research she did for puzzling cases at the clinic, the way she still kept up with every new development in pediatric medicine, as if preparing for a return that might never come. As Ava handed another customer their drink, she caught sight of the morning news playing on the cafe's TV. The headline announced another expansion of Aldridge Medical Center, showing its imposing founder standing before the cameras. She quickly looked away, feeling the familiar ache of her lost world. Little did she know that the man on the screen would soon become intricately entwined with her fate, setting in motion events that would either restore her shattered life or destroy what little she had left. Emily Winter's Louboutin heels clicked purposefully across the marble floors of Aldridge Medical Center's executive suite. At 38, she had masterfully crafted her image as a successful investment banker specializing in healthcare acquisitions. Her perfectly styled blonde hair and designer suits spoke of wealth and influence, masking the ruthless ambition that had driven her to betray Mason Aldridge and his family 15 years ago. Now, as she prepared to orchestrate her biggest move yet, she watched Mason's empire grow with calculating patience. In his expansive office overlooking Central Park, Edward Sullivan studied a worn photograph hidden in his desk drawer. The image showed a newborn baby girl, Ava, whom he had given up for adoption 25 years ago. As one of New York's most influential healthcare investors, Edward had secretly tracked his daughter's career, feeling both pride and guilt as she rose to prominence in pediatric surgery. He had been devastated by her fall from grace, knowing there was more to the story but unable to help without revealing their connection. Sarah Harper, Ava's adoptive mother, worked tirelessly at her small insurance agency, fighting to find coverage for both her children. Years of helping clients navigate the healthcare system had given her an intimate understanding of its flaws. At 55, her once dark hair was streaked with gray, each silver strand earned from nights spent worrying about Tommy's health and Ava's future. Despite the scandal that had engulfed their family, her faith in her daughter never wavered. Dr. Richard Bennett, chief administrator of Mercy Children's Hospital, maintained a facade of professional concern over the Sophie Williams case, but his manicured office held dark secrets. At 60, his distinguished appearance and impressive credentials concealed decades of corruption. He had orchestrated Ava's downfall to cover up his own involvement in a massive insurance fraud scheme, using his position to funnel millions into offshore accounts. Behind every major player lurked Michael Winters, Emily's younger brother and a brilliant computer expert with a dark past. His skills had been instrumental in framing Ava, though he remained haunted by his role in destroying an innocent doctor's career. His sister's hold over him stemmed from a shared childhood trauma that she exploited without mercy. Rachel Anderson, head nurse at Mercy Children's Hospital, had witnessed the events surrounding Sophie Williams' death firsthand. Her silence had been bought with promotions and threats, but her conscience grew heavier with each passing day. She kept a locked drawer containing evidence that could exonerate Ava, waiting for the right moment or enough courage to come forward. Tommy Harper, despite his chronic heart condition, maintained an unshakable optimism that amazed everyone who knew him. At 16, he understood more about hospital politics and medical procedures than most adults, having spent much of his life as a patient. His unwavering belief in his sister's innocence gave Ava strength when everything else seemed hopeless. Detective James Morrison of the New York Police Department's Medical Fraud Division had never closed the Sophie Williams case file, despite pressure from his superiors. 20 years of experience told him the official story didn't add up, and he quietly continued gathering evidence, knowing that somewhere in the tangled web of hospital politics and corporate money lay the truth. These individuals orbited around Mason and Ava like planets around twin suns, each carrying secrets that could either heal or destroy. Their paths would cross and intersect in unexpected ways as events unfolded, forcing them to confront their own moral choices and the consequences of their actions. In the background, the board members of Aldridge Medical Center watched their founder's every move with growing concern. Some remained loyal to Mason's vision of healthcare excellence, while others plotted with Emily Winters to seize control of the empire he had built. And somewhere in the city, Sophie Williams' parents continued their quest for justice, unaware that they were pawns in a game much larger than their personal tragedy. Their public calls for accountability served the interests of those who had actually orchestrated their daughter's death, while the doctor they blamed fought to survive in a world that had turned its back on her. Aldridge Medical Center dominated the Manhattan skyline, its gleaming glass towers rising 60 stories into the clouds. The hospital complex sprawled across 3 city blocks, a monument to modern medicine and Mason Aldridge's vision. The main lobby, with its soaring atrium and cascading water features, felt more like a luxury hotel than a hospital. Italian marble floors reflected the warm lighting, while abstract art pieces worth millions adorned the walls. Behind the impressive facade, the hospital operated like a precision timepiece. The trauma center, renowned nationwide, occupied the ground floor, its dedicated entrance marked by distinctive red lighting. Above, specialized departments were stacked in order of emergency surgery on the lower floors, long-term care near the top. The pediatric wing, Mason's pride, featured cheerful murals and state-of-the-art equipment disguised as playful sculptures. 20 blocks downtown, the Corner Cup Cafe occupied the ground floor of a weathered brownstone. The small shop's exposed brick walls and mismatched furniture created a cozy atmosphere that contrasted sharply with Aldridge's corporate polish. The regular customers loved its worn wooden floors and the perpetual scent of freshly ground coffee. A collection of donated books lined the walls, and local artists' works hung in rotating displays. It was here, among the gentle hiss of espresso machines and quiet conversations, that Ava had found refuge. Mercy Children's Hospital, where Ava's career had imploded, stood in the shadows of Aldridge Medical Center. Once prestigious, the hospital now struggled with budget cuts and declining reputation. Its aging facade and outdated equipment told the story of an institution losing ground to newer, better-funded competitors. The pediatric surgical ward, where Ava had once performed miracles, remained exactly as she'd left it, her name still visible as a ghostly outline where her office plaque had hung. In the heart of the financial district, Edward Sullivan's office suite occupied the entire top floor of a historic building. The decor reflected old money and established power dark wood paneling, oriental rugs, and oil paintings of stern-faced predecessors. His private office featured a hidden door, concealing a room filled with files tracking Ava's life from infancy through her downfall. The free clinic where Ava volunteered operated out of a converted warehouse in the Bronx. Paint peeled from its walls, and the waiting room furniture showed years of wear, but the staff maintained impeccable cleanliness. Children's drawings covered the bulletin boards, and handwritten thank you notes filled Dr. Rodriguez's office, testament to the lives touched by their work despite limited resources. Tommy's room at home had become a miniature medical ward, monitoring equipment disguised among typical teenage possessions. Sports posters covered the walls, while his medication schedule was hidden behind his desk calendar. A telescope by the window pointed toward Aldridge Medical Center's towers, representing both hope and impossibility. Dr. Bennett's office at Mercy occupied a corner suite, its windows overlooking the hospital's modest grounds. Unlike Aldridge's modern aesthetic, Bennett favored traditional decor, leather-bound medical texts, dark wooden furniture, and framed certificates covering every wall. A hidden safe behind a particularly impressive diploma contained documents that could destroy careers and lives. The New York Police Department's Medical Fraud Division operated from a cluttered office in an unremarkable government building. Detective Morrison's desk, piled with case files, faced a board covered in photographs and notes about the Sophie Williams case. Red strings connected key players, all leading back to two central photos, Ava Harper and Richard Bennett. Emily Winters conducted her business from a sleek office in a boutique investment firm. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of both Aldridge Medical Center and Mercy Children's Hospital, a visual reminder of her ultimate goal. A hidden computer server, maintained by her brother Michael, held evidence of years of carefully orchestrated financial fraud. These locations, scattered across the city like pieces on a chessboard, would become the stages where personal dramas, professional ambitions, and long-buried secrets would collide. From the pristine corridors of Aldridge Medical Center to the humble warmth of the corner cup, each setting held pieces of a puzzle that would eventually reshape the lives of everyone involved. Mason Aldridge stared at the email displayed on his desktop screen, his fingers drumming an irritated rhythm on his mahogany desk. Edward Sullivan's message was both an opportunity and a complication. Dear Mason, I look forward to discussing the potential merger of our healthcare networks over dinner next week. As is my tradition, I expect this to be a social event where we can get to know each other beyond our professional facades. Please bring your significant other to join us. My wife Catherine will also be attending. Best regards, Edward Sullivan. Mason leaned back in his chair, loosening his tie with growing frustration. The merger with Sullivan Health Systems could expand Aldridge Medical Center's reach across the East Coast, potentially doubling their capacity to help patients. But Sullivan's old-fashioned insistence on mixing business with personal life presented a problem. After 15 years of focusing solely on rebuilding his family's legacy, Mason's personal life was non-existent. Clara, he called through the intercom to his assistant, come in here for a moment. Clara Matthews entered, her tablet ready. At 55, she had been with Mason since the early days, one of the few people he trusted completely. Sullivan wants a dinner meeting, Mason explained, but he's insisting on making it a couple's affair. Options. Clara's expression remained professionally neutral, though her eyes betrayed concern. We could decline, sir, but Sullivan's known for taking personal offense when his social overtures are rejected. Thompson Healthcare lost their chance at a partnership last year after their CEO showed up to dinner alone. Mason stood, walking to the window overlooking his medical empire. The setting sun cast long shadows across the hospital complex, a reminder of how much he had to lose if this merger fell through. What about Rebecca? He suggested, referring to his sister. On assignment with Doctors Without Borders for the next 3 months, Clara reminded him. Besides, Mr. Sullivan knows your family connections. It would appear deceptive. Mason ran a hand through his dark hair, a rare gesture of frustration. We need this merger, Clara. Sullivan's network of rural hospitals would allow us to help thousands more patients. Their research facilities would accelerate our treatment programs. We can't let this opportunity slip away because I'm single. Clara hesitated before speaking. There is another option, sir. We could arrange for someone to accompany you, someone professional, discreet, who understands the importance of the situation. Mason turned sharply. You mean hire someone to pretend to be my partner? The idea seemed absurd, yet he found himself considering it. It would have to be someone convincing. Sullivan's been in this business for 40 years. He'd see through any obvious deception. I can make some inquiries, Clara offered. There are agencies that specialize in providing companions for business events. Professional, educated individuals who can handle sophisticated social situations. Mason shook his head. Too risky. One background check from Sullivan's team and the whole thing falls apart. He paced the office, thinking aloud. We need someone real, someone with substance, intelligence. Medical knowledge would be ideal, given Sullivan's background. Someone who can hold their own in conversations about healthcare policy and hospital administration. Clara made a note on her tablet. I'll start compiling candidates. What else should I look for? Someone with nothing to lose, Mason added grimly. Someone who understands discretion because they need it as much as we do. He paused, a thought striking him. And Clara? Keep this completely off the books. No paper trail, no digital records. If anyone asks, this conversation never happened. Of course, sir. When do you need the candidates? Mason checked Sullivan's email again. Dinner's in 10 days. I'll need to meet potential candidates by the end of this week to allow time for preparation. As Clara turned to leave, Mason added one final requirement: find someone who understands that this is strictly business. After Emily, he let the sentence hang unfinished, but Clara understood. After Emily Winter's betrayal, Mason had built walls around his heart as solid as the ones around his hospital. Once alone, Mason returned to the window, watching the city lights begin to twinkle in the gathering dusk. The empire he'd built from the ashes of his family's destruction stood as a testament to his determination. Every decision, every sacrifice had been made to ensure that no other family would suffer as his had. This merger with Sullivan could help him achieve that goal on an even larger scale. Yet as he contemplated the charade he was about to orchestrate, Mason felt a twinge of his father's voice in his conscience. James Aldridge had built his practice on honesty and personal connections. What would he think of his son now, planning to deceive a potential business partner with a fake relationship? Sometimes the right thing and the necessary thing are different, Mason muttered to himself, words he'd learned the hard way over 15 years of rebuilding. Little did he know that his carefully planned deception was about to lead him straight into a truth that would shake the foundations of everything he'd built. The corner cup was unusually busy that Wednesday morning when Mason Aldridge pushed through the door, his attention focused on the urgent emails filling his phone screen. The familiar aroma of freshly ground coffee beans and warm pastries filled the air, a sharp contrast to the sterile environment of his hospital. Welcome to the corner cup. What can I get for you today? The voice that greeted him was warm and professional, with an underlying note of quiet confidence that made Mason look up from his phone. His carefully prepared coffee order died on his lips as he met the barista's gaze. Her blue eyes held an intelligence and depth that seemed at odds with her surroundings, and something about her struck him as hauntingly familiar. Just a black coffee, he managed, still trying to place where he might have seen her before. Her name tag read Ava, and as she turned to prepare his order, Mason found himself studying her movements, precise, efficient, almost surgical in their accuracy. Then it hit him. He had seen her face before, in news articles and medical journals. Dr. Ava Harper, the brilliant pediatric surgeon whose career had imploded in the Sophie Williams case. The story had sent shockwaves through the medical community, though Mason, consumed with his own hospital's expansion, had paid little attention to the details at the time. As Ava worked the espresso machine, Mason observed how other customers responded to her. She remembered complex orders without writing them down, offered medical advice to a mother worried about her child's cough, and gently reminded an elderly customer about medication timing with his coffee. Even in this humble setting, her medical training showed through. "Here's your coffee, Mr. Aldridge," Ava said, placing the cup on the counter. Mason's surprise must have shown on his face because she added, "Your hospital's impossible to miss from my brother's window. He follows all the news about Aldridge Medical Center's cardiac program." The mention of her brother Mason remembered now, a teenager with a serious heart condition, sparked an idea. Here was someone with medical knowledge, social grace, and most importantly, a compelling reason to be discreet. Before he could overthink it, Mason made a decision. "MS. Harper," he began, lowering his voice, "I have a rather unusual proposition for you." Ava's expression shifted subtly, a mix of wariness and curiosity crossing her features. "I'm listening," she replied cautiously. Mason glanced at the growing line behind him. "Perhaps we could discuss this when you're less busy. It's a business proposition, completely legitimate, but somewhat unconventional." Ava studied him for a long moment, her professional smile never wavering. "I take my break at 2. If you're serious, you can come back then." When Mason returned that afternoon, he found Ava sitting at a corner table, her barista apron gone, replaced by a simple but elegant blouse. She looked more like the doctor she had been than the barista she was now. "All right, Mr. Aldridge," she said as he sat down, "what's this proposition of yours?" Mason laid out the situation with Sullivan, watching Ava's reactions carefully. She listened without interruption, her face revealing nothing until he finished. "Let me make sure I understand," she said finally. "You want to hire me to pretend to be your girlfriend for a business dinner? Me, a disgraced doctor working as a barista?" "I need someone who can hold their own in conversations about healthcare policy and hospital administration," Mason explained. "Someone who understands medical terminology and can discuss complex health issues intelligently." "And someone with nothing left to lose," Ava added sharply. Mason met her gaze directly. "Someone who understands the value of discretion. The compensation would be significant, enough to cover several months of your brother's treatments." At the mention of her brother, Ava's professional facade cracked slightly. "How do you know about Tommy?" "I make it my business to know about potential cardiac patients in our service area," Mason replied carefully. "Especially ones who might benefit from our new treatment programs." Ava leaned back, a bitter smile playing at her lips. "So that's the real offer. I play pretend girlfriend, and my brother gets considered for your program." "No," Mason said firmly. "The two are completely separate. Whatever you decide about my proposition, I'll have my team review Tommy's case. That's not a bribe, Ms. Harper. It's what we should have done already." Something in his tone must have convinced her, because Ava's expression softened slightly. "When is this dinner?" she asked. "Next Tuesday. I'll provide everything you need: clothes, accessories, whatever makes you comfortable. All you have to do is be yourself, minus the current occupation." Ava was quiet for a long moment, her fingers tracing patterns on the worn wooden table. Finally, she looked up, her blue eyes meeting his with unexpected intensity. "I have conditions," she said. First, Ava began, her voice firm and professional. "This is a one-time arrangement. No matter how well the dinner goes, no repeat performances." Mason nodded. "Agreed." "Second, I want a detailed contract that protects both of us. Something that ensures this stays confidential and clearly defines the boundaries of our arrangement." "My lawyers can draw that up immediately," Mason replied, impressed by her foresight. Third, Ava continued, her voice softening slightly. Whatever you're planning to pay me, I want an equal amount donated to the children's ward at the free clinic in the Bronx. Dr. Rodriguez runs it, they do good work there. Mason studied her, noting how her eyes lit up when she mentioned the clinic. Even after everything she'd been through, her first thought was still helping others. Consider it done. Anything else? Yes, Ava leaned forward, her expression intensely serious. I need your word that this isn't some elaborate scheme to humiliate me further. I've lost my career, my reputation, and nearly everything else, but I still have my dignity. The vulnerability beneath her professional demeanor struck Mason unexpectedly. MS, Harper, you have my word. This is strictly business, a mutually beneficial arrangement between two professionals. Ava sat back, considering his words. Tell me about the dinner. Who exactly is Edward Sullivan, and what kind of questions should I expect? Sullivan's old school, Mason explained. He believes you can't trust someone in business unless you know them personally. He'll want to hear our story, how we met, what we have in common. Nothing too intrusive, but enough to convince him we're genuine. We'll need a convincing backstory, then Ava mused. Something close enough to the truth to be believable. Perhaps we met through mutual connections in the medical community. Mason shook his head. Too risky. Sullivan might try to verify through his contacts. Let's keep it simple, we met here at the cafe. I was impressed by your intelligence and medical knowledge, not knowing your background. You were intrigued by my vision for healthcare reform. And when did this supposedly happen? 3 months ago. Long enough to be serious, recent enough that we're still somewhat private about it. Ava nodded slowly. What about my current situation? Sullivan's bound to ask what I do. You're consulting on healthcare policy while considering your next career move, Mason suggested. It's vague enough to avoid specifics, but prestigious enough to fit with my position. And if he asks about my previous work, we stick to the truth as much as possible. You were a pediatric surgeon. If he pushes for details about why you left, we'll say it's still too painful to discuss. Ava's fingers traced the rim of her coffee cup, her mind clearly working through scenarios. What about personal details? Couples know intimate things about each other. Mason pulled out his phone, opening his calendar. We have 6 days, I'll clear my evenings. We need to learn enough about each other to be convincing. Your favorite book, Ava asked suddenly. To Kill a Mockingbird, Mason answered without hesitation. Yours. When Breath Becomes Air by Paul Kalanithi, Ava replied. A neurosurgeon's memoir about facing death. It means something different to me now. The moment of understanding passed between them. They were both survivors in their own ways, shaped by loss and injustice. One last condition, Ava said quietly. If at any point I feel uncomfortable or that my presence might harm your business interests, I want the freedom to leave. No questions asked. Mason extended his hand across the table. You have my word. Should we make it official? Ava looked at his offered hand for a long moment before taking it. Her grip was firm, professional, a surgeon's handshake. We should practice that, she said. Couples don't shake hands. Right, Mason agreed, suddenly aware of how long they'd been holding hands. He pulled back, reaching for his briefcase. I'll have the contract drawn up tonight. Can you meet tomorrow to review it? I work until 6, but I'm free after that. I'll send a car. We can discuss the details over dinner, might as well start practicing. Ava stood, smoothing her shirt. Remember, Mr. Aldridge, this is strictly business. Of course, MS, Harper. And you should probably start calling me Mason. A ghost of a smile crossed her face. Then I suppose it's Ava, she glanced at the clock. My break's over. I should get back to work. As Mason watched her return to her place behind the counter, He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd just set something in motion that was far bigger than a simple business arrangement. What he didn't know was that across town, Edward Sullivan was studying a photograph of a baby girl he'd given up for adoption, wondering if fate was finally giving him a chance to make things right. The week before the Sullivan dinner passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Each evening, Mason would send his car to pick up Ava after her shift, bringing her to his penthouse where they worked on crafting their story. What started as strictly business sessions began to shift into something more complex. "Your favorite food?" Ava asked on the third night, curled up on Mason's leather sofa with a notepad. They'd been trading personal details for hours, building a believable history. "Honestly, my mother's apple pie," Mason answered, his voice softening with memory. "She'd make it every Sunday, even when money was tight." "Yours?" "Vietnamese pho," Ava replied. The tiny restaurant near the hospital. She stopped abruptly, pain flashing across her face at the mention of her former life. Mason watched her recover, noting how quickly she rebuilt her professional facade. It was a skill he recognized from his own experience with loss. Without thinking, he reached for the phone. "There's a Vietnamese place downtown that's still open. Hungry?" 20 minutes later, they sat amid steam and spices, watching Ava demonstrate the proper way to eat pho. "You're doing it all wrong," she laughed, reaching across to adjust Mason's chopsticks. "Here, like this." The casual touch sent an unexpected current through both of them. Ava pulled back quickly, focusing intently on her bowl. Mason cleared his throat, returning to their preparation. "Sullivan will probably ask about our first date." "Right," Ava agreed, too quickly. "We should align our stories." But complications arose from unexpected quarters. The next day, while Ava was working her shift at the Corner Cup, a familiar face appeared at the counter. Dr. Richard Bennett from Mercy Children's Hospital. Well, Bennett smirked, from surgeon to barista. "How the mighty have fallen." Ava's hands trembled slightly as she took his order, but her voice remained steady. "What can I get you, Dr. Bennett?" "A warning," actually, he replied quietly. "I saw you getting into Mason Aldridge's car last night. Whatever you're planning, remember, one phone call from me, and any chance of you ever practicing medicine again disappears completely." After Bennett left, Ava called Mason, her voice tight with anxiety. "We need to talk." That evening, in Mason's penthouse, Ava paced nervously. Bennett's threat changes things. "If he starts asking questions about us." "Let him," Mason interrupted. "In fact, this could work in our favor. Makes our relationship more believable, if people are already noticing." "You don't understand," Ava insisted. "Bennett has power over my future. He..." "Tell me," Mason said softly. "Tell me what really happened at Mercy." For a moment, Ava stood silent by the window, her silhouette stark against the city lights. Then, slowly, she began to speak. She told him about the inconsistencies in Sophie Williams' charts, the medication signatures that didn't match hers, the speed with which Bennett had pushed for her license revocation. Mason listened intently, his business mind catching details Ava herself hadn't considered. The timing, he mused. When exactly did all this happen? 6 months ago, right after Mercy announced its financial troubles. And right before Bennett started negotiating with larger hospitals for a buyout, Mason added, pieces clicking into place. "Ava, I think you were set up to take the fall for something much bigger." Their eyes met across the room, understanding passing between them. In that moment, the line between their pretense and reality blurred further. The next evening's preparation session felt different. Their practiced touches lingered longer than necessary. Their constructed stories contained more truth than fiction. When Mason helped Ava with her coat, his hand stayed on her shoulders a moment too long. "We should practice dancing," Ava suggested suddenly. "Sullivan's bound to have music at dinner." Mason pulled up a playlist on his phone, soft jazz filling the penthouse. As he took Ava in his arms, the professional space between them dissolved. She fit perfectly against him, her head resting naturally on his shoulder as they swayed. "Tell me about Tommy," Mason murmured, trying to maintain focus on their preparation. Ava spoke softly about her brother's condition, his courage, his unwavering faith in her innocence. Mason found himself sharing stories of his own sister, of losing his parents, of rebuilding from nothing. As the music played on, neither mentioned that they'd been dancing long after any reasonable practice session would have ended. When the car finally arrived to take Ava home, they both felt the evening had shifted something fundamental between them. But in their focus on each other, neither noticed the photographer across the street, documenting their growing closeness. Nor did they see Emily Winters in her office, studying those same photos with calculating eyes, planning her next move in a game that had been 15 years in the making. The stage was set for a dinner that would change everything, but not in the way any of them expected. The morning of the Sullivan dinner arrived with an unexpected complication. Ava stood in her small apartment bathroom, staring at her reflection, while her phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from Tommy's doctor. Her brother's condition had worsened overnight, requiring immediate tests at the free clinic. "I can't make our final preparation lunch," she told Mason when he called. "Tommy needs me." There was only a brief pause before Mason replied, "Text me the clinic's address. I'll meet you there." An hour later, Ava looked up from Tommy's bedside to find Mason Aldridge walking into the clinic's shabby waiting room, looking completely out of place in his tailored suit. But instead of the discomfort she expected, she watched in amazement as he sat down next to an elderly woman, listening intently to her stories while they waited. "Your brother's preliminary tests are done," Dr. Rodriguez informed Ava, glancing curiously at Mason. "But we're limited in what we can do here." Before Ava could respond, Mason stepped forward. "I've taken the liberty of arranging for Tommy to be transferred to Aldridge Medical Center. A cardiac specialist is waiting." "We can't afford," Ava began. "Consider it part of our arrangement," Mason said quietly, but his eyes conveyed something beyond their business deal. Throughout the morning, Ava watched Mason interact with Tommy, surprised by his genuine interest in her brother's condition. He spoke to Tommy directly, explaining complex procedures in terms the teenager could understand, treating him with respect rather than condescension. "He's different than I expected," Tommy confided when Mason stepped out to make some calls. "The way the news shows him, all corporate and cold. But he actually listens." Ava had noticed the same thing. Over the past week, she'd seen glimpses of the man behind the business facade, his dry humor, his genuine passion for improving healthcare, the sadness that lingered in his eyes when he spoke of his parents. By afternoon, Tommy was settled in a private room at Aldridge Medical Center, receiving treatment that would have been impossible at the free clinic. Ava stood by the window, watching the sunset paint the city gold. "Thank you," she said when Mason joined her. "Not just for Tommy, but for coming to the clinic, for understanding." Mason moved closer, their shoulders almost touching. "I meant what I said about his treatment being separate from our arrangement. This isn't about tonight's dinner." The honesty in his voice made Ava turn to face him. In the soft evening light, she could see the genuine concern in his eyes, so different from the calculated businessman she'd first met. "We should get ready," she said softly, though neither moved. "Sullivan's expecting us in 2 hours." But Ava, Mason began, then hesitated. The sound of her name in his voice sent an unexpected shiver through her. "What happens after tonight?" Before she could answer, a nurse entered with Tommy's medication, breaking the moment. But the question lingered between them as they parted to prepare for dinner. In her borrowed designer dress, hair elegantly styled, Ava barely recognized herself in the mirror. The woman who looked back at her seemed to belong in Mason's world of wealth and influence. Yet when his car arrived and she saw him waiting, Handsome in his tuxedo, but with his tie slightly crooked, it was the imperfection that touched her heart. "Here," she said, reaching up to straighten his tie. The familiar gesture felt different now, charged with unspoken emotions. "We need to talk," Mason said suddenly, his hands catching hers, "about what this week has meant." "Not now," Ava interrupted gently. "We have a role to play tonight, remember." But as they drove toward the restaurant, both knew their carefully constructed pretense had evolved into something neither had expected. The easy conversation they'd practiced felt natural now. Their rehearsed touches carried genuine warmth. The story of how they met, crafted so carefully for Sullivan's benefit, had somehow become interwoven with real memories, real feelings. "Ready?" Mason asked as they pulled up to the restaurant, offering his arm. Ava took it, feeling the solid strength of him beside her. "Ready," she replied, though her heart raced with more than just dinner anxiety. What neither of them knew was that this evening would test not just their acting abilities, but the very real connection growing between them. For waiting inside was not just Edward Sullivan, but a web of secrets that would force them to question everything they thought they knew about each other. As they walked into the restaurant, Ava felt Mason's hand settle protectively at the small of her back. The gesture wasn't one they'd practiced, but it felt right, as did her instinctive step closer to him. For this moment, at least, they weren't pretending anymore. The private dining room at Le Bernardin fell silent as Emily Winters made her entrance, 15 years of calculated timing evident in her perfectly timed interruption of Mason and Ava's dinner with the Sullivans. Her designer dress and flawless appearance spoke of wealth and success, but her eyes held a predatory gleam as she approached their table. "Mason, darling," Emily purred, placing a manicured hand on his shoulder. What a delightful surprise. She turned to Edward Sullivan with practiced charm. "Edward, I had no idea you knew my Mason." Mason stiffened under her touch, his face a mask of controlled tension. Ava watched the color drain from his features, recognizing the name that had haunted their conversations about his past. This was the woman who had destroyed his family. "Emily," Mason managed, his voice tight. "I wasn't aware you were back in New York." "Oh, I've recently acquired some interesting investment opportunities here," Emily smiled, her gaze sliding dismissively over Ava Viva before returning to Mason. "Healthcare is such a fascinating field, isn't it?" Edward Sullivan watched the interaction with sharp interest, while his wife Catherine's eyes narrowed at the obvious tension. Ava felt the carefully constructed evening beginning to unravel. "Miss Winters," Sullivan said carefully, "I wasn't aware you and Mason had a history." "Ancient history," Mason cut in firmly, his hand finding Ava's under the table. The gesture seemed as much to steady himself as to reassure her. Emily's laugh tinkled like broken glass. "Ancient? Darling, surely the love of your life deserves more than that description. Or haven't you told your friend about us?" Ava felt Mason's grip tighten on her hand. She could see the struggle in his eyes, the pain of old wounds reopening, the fear of losing control of the situation. Without thinking, she leaned into him, a gesture of support that wasn't part of their rehearsed performance. "Actually," Ava said smoothly, meeting Emily's calculating stare, "Mason has told me everything about his past, including the investment fraud that destroyed his family's medical practice." Emily's perfect composure slipped for just a moment, but it was enough for Ava to catch a glimpse of something dangerous beneath the polished surface. My, Emily recovered, pulling up a chair uninvited. "He really has been honest with you." "How?" "Refreshing." Sullivan was watching the exchange with increasing interest. "Miss Winters, perhaps you'd care to join us? We were just discussing the future of private healthcare in New York." "I'd be delighted," Emily smiled, signaling for another place setting. "In fact, I have some rather interesting news about Mercy Children's Hospital that might interest everyone at this table." Ava felt her blood run cold. The pointed look Emily gave her made it clear this was no coincidence. Somehow, Emily knew about her past at Mercy. Throughout the meal, Emily wove a complex web of subtle barbs and veiled threats, each comment carefully calculated to undermine Mason and Ava's relationship in Sullivan's eyes. She spoke of shared memories with Mason, of insider knowledge about his business practices, all while maintaining an air of innocent reminiscence. "You know," Emily mentioned casually over dessert, "I always admired Mason's commitment to thorough background checks on everyone he works with. It saved him from some potentially embarrassing situations." The threat was clear. Emily knew about their arrangement, or at least suspected enough to be dangerous. But as Ava watched Mason wrestle with his past demons throughout the evening, she realized something had changed. Their pretense had become real enough that Emily's attempts to separate them were having the opposite effect. "Excuse me," Ava said suddenly, standing. "I need to check on my brother." It wasn't entirely a lie. She did need to check Tommy's test results, but she also needed a moment to think. In the restaurant's elegant bathroom, Ava gripped the marble countertop, studying her reflection. The woman who looked back at her wasn't just playing a role anymore. Somewhere between their careful preparation and this moment, she had developed real feelings for Mason Aldridge. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "How much is Mason paying you to play girlfriend? Would you like to know what he's really planning for Mercy Children's Hospital?" Before she could process the message, the bathroom door opened and Emily entered, her smile as sharp as a scalpel. "We need to talk, Dr. Harper. About your future, your brother's health, and what's really going on with Mason Aldridge." The harsh ring of a hospital phone shattered the tense standoff in the restaurant bathroom. Dr. Rodriguez's voice trembled as she delivered the news Tommy had collapsed during his evening tests, his heart showing signs of severe arrhythmia. Ava forgot about Emily, forgot about the dinner, forgot about everything except getting to her brother. She burst back into the dining room, her face pale. "Mason, I need to go. It's Tommy." Mason was on his feet instantly, all thoughts of the merger forgotten. "Edward, I apologize, but we have an emergency. My car's outside." Sullivan watched with shrewd eyes as Mason wrapped his arm protectively around Ava's shoulders, guiding her quickly through the restaurant. Emily's attempt to interject was cut short by the genuine fear in Ava's eyes. The ride to Aldridge Medical Center was a blur. Ava clutched Mason's hand, her medical knowledge making Tommy's condition all too clear. "His heart can't take much more of this," she whispered. "We're losing him." In the cardiac unit, Dr. Sarah Collins met them with charts and grave expressions. "The experimental treatment we discussed might be his only option now," she explained. "But given the risks and the cost..." "Cost is not an issue," Mason interrupted. "Whatever he needs." "Mason, no," Ava protested weakly. "You've already done too much." "This isn't about our arrangement," Mason said firmly. "This is about saving your brother's life." Through the window of Tommy's room, they could see him hooked up to various machines, looking smaller and more vulnerable than his 16 years. Sarah Harper, Ava's adoptive mother, sat by his bedside, her face lined with worry. "The treatment requires immediate action," Dr. Collins continued. "But we need parental consent." Sarah looked up as they entered, her eyes moving between her daughter and Mason. "They've explained the risks," she said quietly. "It's experimental, Ava. As his medical proxy, what do you think?" Ava felt the weight of the decision crushing her. As a doctor, she knew the statistics, the potential complications. As a sister, she couldn't bear to lose him. "What exactly are the survival rates?" she asked Dr. Collins. "Without the treatment, his chances are less than 20%. With it, we're looking at 60 to 70%, based on preliminary trials." Mason stood slightly apart, watching Ava wrestle with the decision. He wanted to help, to take the burden from her shoulders, but he knew this had to be her choice. "There's something else you should know," Dr. Collins added hesitantly. The treatment was developed in partnership with Mercy Children's Hospital. Dr. Bennett would need to be consulted. The name hit Ava like a physical blow. Richard Bennett, the man who had destroyed her career, now held her brother's life in his hands. She turned to Mason, seeing the same realization in his eyes. "I'll handle Bennett," Mason said quietly. "Make the decision based on what's best for Tommy, not hospital politics." Sarah reached for her daughter's hand. "Ava, sweetheart, what are you thinking?" Ava moved to Tommy's bedside, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. His skin felt clammy, his breathing labored. The cardiac monitor showed increasingly irregular patterns. "Do you remember," she said softly, "when you were little and had your first heart scare? You told me you weren't afraid because your big sister was a doctor and would always protect you." Tommy stirred slightly, his eyes fluttering open. "Still, trust you," he managed weakly. Ava felt tears sliding down her cheeks as she turned to Dr. Collins. "Start the treatment. I'll sign whatever you need." The next hours were a whirlwind of activity as Tommy was prepped for the procedure. Mason made calls, pulling strings to expedite approvals and assembling the best cardiac team available. Sarah dozed fitfully in a waiting room chair while Ava paced, her medical knowledge now a torment as she imagined every possible complication. "You should rest," Mason said gently, offering her coffee. "But I can't," Ava replied, her voice rough with emotion. "Not until I know he's okay." She paused, looking at Mason. "Why are you still here?" "The dinner with Sullivan." "Can wait," Mason finished firmly. "Some things are more important than business deals." As dawn broke over the city, Dr. Collins emerged from the treatment room, exhausted but smiling. "He's responding well. The next 24 hours are critical, but I'm optimistic." The relief that flooded through Ava made her knees buckle. Mason caught her before she could fall, holding her as she finally allowed herself to break down. Neither of them noticed Emily Winters watching from the hallway, her face unreadable as she observed their embrace. In her hand she held a file that could destroy them both, but for the first time in 15 years, she felt a flicker of doubt about her plans. Edward Sullivan stood in Tommy's hospital room doorway the next morning, watching the scene before him with intense interest. Ava had fallen asleep in the chair beside her brother's bed, her hand still clasping Tommy's, while Mason kept a protective vigil nearby. "Mr. Aldrich," Sullivan said softly, motioning Mason into the hallway. "A word." Outside the room, Sullivan's usual business demeanor had been replaced by something more personal, almost vulnerable. "Tell me about her," he said, his eyes fixed on Ava through the window. Sir Mason asked, caught off guard by the unusual request. "Ava Harper." "Where did she grow up? What do you know about her family?" Mason felt a surge of protectiveness. "With all due respect, Mr. Sullivan, why the sudden interest in Ava's background?" Sullivan pulled an old photograph from his wallet, a young woman holding a baby. "Because 25 years ago, I gave up my daughter for adoption. The Harpers were the family who took her." The revelation hit Mason like a physical blow. He studied Sullivan's face, seeing for the first time the similarities to Ava, the same determined set of the jaw, the same intelligent eyes. "Does she know?" Mason asked quietly. "No," Sullivan replied, his voice heavy with regret. "I followed her career from afar. The scholarship to medical school, her rise to chief of pediatric surgery at Mercy, even her fall from grace. I wanted to help during the Sophie Williams case, but revealing yourself then would have seemed opportunistic," Mason finished, understanding dawning. "The dinner invitation wasn't just about the merger, was it?" Sullivan shook his head. "I needed to meet her, to see what kind of woman she'd become. When I heard rumors about you dating her, it seemed like fate." Inside the room, Ava stirred, checking Tommy's vital signs with practiced efficiency. Sullivan watched her movements with barely concealed emotion. Her birth mother died when Ava was just a baby. Sullivan continued. I was young, struggling to make ends meet. The Harpers could give her everything I couldn't, but I'd never stopped thinking about her. Mason felt the weight of their deception pressing down on him. Mr. Sullivan, there's something you should know about my relationship with Ava. That it began as an arrangement for our dinner. Sullivan's eyes twinkled with unexpected humor. I've been in business 40 years, son. I recognize the signs. What interests me is how real it's become. Before Mason could respond, Dr. Bennett appeared at the end of the hallway, his face darkening at the sight of them. Mr. Sullivan, what a surprise. I wasn't aware you were visiting our former employee. Sullivan's demeanor changed instantly, becoming the shrewd businessman Mason knew. Dr. Bennett, yes, I have a particular interest in Dr. Harper's case. In fact, I've been reviewing the Sophie Williams incident quite thoroughly. Bennett's face paled slightly. That matter was settled months ago. Was it? Sullivan's voice carried a dangerous edge, because my investigators have uncovered some rather interesting discrepancies in the hospital's records from that period. Mason watched the exchange with growing understanding. Sullivan hadn't just been following Ava's career, he'd been gathering evidence to clear her name. Now, Sullivan continued, I suggest you ensure my daughter receives the best possible care during her brother's treatment. We wouldn't want any unfortunate truths coming to light, would we? Bennett retreated quickly, leaving Mason and Sullivan alone in the hallway. Your daughter, Mason repeated softly. You're going to tell her? Soon Sullivan nodded. But first, we need to deal with the people who tried to destroy her career, starting with Richard Bennett and Emily Winters. Mason's head snapped up. Emily? What does she have to do with this? Everything, Sullivan replied grimly. She's been working with Bennett for years, helping him cover up financial fraud at Mercy. The Sophie Williams case was just the tip of the iceberg. Through the window, they watched as Ava tenderly adjusted Tommy's blankets, unaware that her whole world was about to change. Mason felt his heart constrict, knowing the revelations to come would either strengthen their growing bond or shatter it completely. Mr. Sullivan, Mason said finally, whatever happens next, I want you to know my feelings for Ava are real. They may have started as pretense, but... I know, son. Sullivan smiled. That's why I'm trusting you to help me make this right. She's going to need both of us in the storm that's coming. Detective James Morrison sat in his dimly lit office at the Medical Fraud Division, spreading photographs across his desk. The images told a disturbing story, Doctor. Richard Bennett entering offshore banks in the Cayman Islands, Emily Winters meeting with suspicious characters in hidden locations, and financial documents showing millions disappearing from Mercy Children's Hospital. Tell me again about the night Sophie Williams died, Morrison asked Rachel Anderson, the head nurse who sat nervously across from him. Rachel twisted her hands in her lap. It wasn't Dr. Harper's fault. The medication that killed Sophie, it was added to her chart after the fact. I saw Bennett himself forge the prescription. Morrison nodded, adding her statement to an already thick file. And you've kept quiet all this time because... Bennett threatened my job, my license. He said he'd make sure I never worked in healthcare again. Rachel pulled out a USB drive with shaking hands. But I've been collecting evidence. Every falsified record, every suspicious death, every missing dollar. Across town, in his Aldridge Medical Center office, Mason reviewed copies of the same evidence with Edward Sullivan. The scope of corruption at Mercy was staggering: years of systematic fraud, endangered patients, and destroyed careers. Bennett's been siphoning money from the hospital's research funds, Mason explained, pointing to financial statements. Every time they got close to being discovered, they'd create a scandal to distract the board. Ava's case wasn't the first, but it was the biggest. Because she noticed the discrepancies in their billing, Sullivan added grimly. She was getting too close to the truth. A knock at the door interrupted them. Clara entered, her face tense. "Sir, Dr. Bennett is here. He's demanding to see Tommy's treatment records." Mason and Sullivan exchanged looks. "Show him in," Mason decided. "It's time we had this conversation." Bennett strode in, his usual arrogance faltering slightly at the sight of Sullivan. "This is a private hospital matter," he began. Like the Sophie Williams case was a private matter, Sullivan's voice cut through Bennett's bluster, or the millions missing from Mercy's pediatric fund. Color drained from Bennett's face as Mason began laying out documents on his desk. "We have everything, Richard. The falsified records, the offshore accounts, the witnesses. Did you really think you could hide it forever?" "You don't understand." Bennett's composure cracked. Mercy was failing. The fraud started small, just enough to keep departments running. Then Emily Winters came with her investment schemes. And the bodies started piling up. Mason finished coldly. "Innocent patients died. Good doctors lost their careers, all to cover your tracks." "I can explain everything," Bennett began, reaching for his phone. "I wouldn't," Sullivan interrupted. "The FBI is already talking to Emily Winters. She's been quite cooperative." In Tommy's hospital room, Ava sat unaware of the drama unfolding in Mason's office. She was focused on her brother's improving vital signs when Rachel Anderson appeared in the doorway. "Dr. Harper," Rachel's voice shook. "I need to tell you something about Sophie Williams." Ava felt her world tilt as Rachel confessed everything: the falsified records, Bennett's threats, the years of silence. "I'm so sorry," Rachel finished, tears streaming down her face. "I should have come forward sooner." Before Ava could respond, shouting erupted in the hallway. Bennett ran past the room, pursued by hospital security. Moments later, Mason and Sullivan appeared. "Ava," Mason said gently, "there's something you need to see." In Mason's office, they showed her everything: the evidence of Bennett's corruption, Emily's involvement, the systematic destruction of anyone who threatened to expose them. Ava read Sophie Williams' real medical records, finally understanding what had really happened that night. "All this time," she whispered, documents trembling in her hands, "all these months of blame and shame." "Your name will be cleared," Sullivan promised, his voice carrying an emotion Ava didn't understand. "Bennett and Emily will face justice." As if summoned by his words, Emily Winters was led past the office by FBI agents, her perfect composure finally shattered. She caught sight of Ava through the glass walls. "I'm sorry," Emily called out desperately. "I never meant for anyone to die. It just got so out of control." Ava watched her disappear into the elevator, feeling strangely empty. The vindication she'd dreamed of felt hollow compared to the lives lost to Bennett's greed. "There's more," Mason said softly, taking her hand. "Something you need to know about Edward Sullivan." But before he could continue, alarms blared from the cardiac unit. Tommy's monitors were showing critical warnings. In the chaos that followed, revelations about biological fathers would have to wait. As Ava ran toward her brother's room, the truth about Mercy's corruption spread through the hospital like wildfire. Staff members came forward with their own stories, more evidence emerged, and the full scope of Bennett's crimes began to come to light. Detective Morrison, watching the scene unfold from the nurse's station, made a final note in his file: sometimes justice comes from unexpected places. Today it came from a disgraced doctor, a reformed nurse, and a businessman who remembered his conscience. In the dimly lit interrogation room of the FBI's New York office, Emily Winters sat perfectly poised despite her handcuffs, her designer suit incongruous against the stark surroundings. Across the table, Detective Morrison watched her calculated smile with practiced skepticism. "I'll make a deal," Emily said smoothly, "but I want to speak to Mason Aldridge first, alone." When Mason arrived, Emily's mask slipped slightly, revealing a glimpse of the desperation beneath. "Mason, darling, surely you can see this is all a misunderstanding." Like the misunderstanding that destroyed my family, Mason's voice was ice cold. Or the one that ruined Ava's career. Ava Harper. Emily laughed bitterly. Your pretend girlfriend. Oh yes, I know all about your little arrangement. What would Sullivan think if he knew you'd hired someone to deceive him? Mason kept his face neutral, though his hands clenched under the table. Is that your play, Emily? Blackmail. Think about it, Mason. Your reputation, your hospitals, everything you've built, it all depends on trust. What happens when people learn you're as capable of deception as I am? What do you want? Emily leaned forward, her voice dropping to a seductive whisper. Drop the charges. Help me deal with Bennett. We could run Aldridge Medical Center together, just like we always planned. We never planned anything together, Mason corrected. You planned to steal my family's money. You planned to destroy my father's practice. And now you've planned to ruin an innocent doctor's life. Innocent? Emily's laugh turned harsh. Do you really know anything about Ava Harper? Did you know she was investigating Mercy's finances before the Sophie Williams case? That she was planning to expose irregularities that would have implicated your precious hospital too? Mason felt his blood run cold. What are you talking about? Emily pulled a file from her lawyer's briefcase. Mercy wasn't the only hospital with creative accounting, Mason. Ava had evidence of similar patterns at Aldridge Medical Center. Bennett just got to her first. Mason opened the file with shaking hands. There, in Ava's neat handwriting, were notes about financial discrepancies across several hospitals, including his own. But these weren't recent, they were dated before the Sophie Williams case, before he'd even met Ava. She's been using you, Emily pressed her advantage. Getting close to you, gaining access to your hospital's records. Why do you think she agreed to your little charade so easily? For a moment doubt crept into Mason's mind. Had he been so blinded by his growing feelings that he'd missed signs of deception? But then he remembered Ava's face when she watched over Tommy, her genuine surprise at his help, the unguarded moments they'd shared. No one could fake that level of authenticity. Nice try, Emily said, standing. But you forgot something important. I've seen real integrity. I've seen someone sacrifice everything to protect patients. You wouldn't understand that kind of honor. Emily's composure cracked. You're making a mistake. I have more evidence, more secrets. Save it for the prosecutors. Mason turned to leave, then paused. You know what the real difference is between you and Ava? She lost everything trying to save lives. You lost everything trying to save yourself. But Emily had one last card to play. Ask her about December 12th, she called after him. The day before Sophie Williams died. Ask her where she really was. Mason hesitated at the door, and Emily smiled, knowing she'd planted a seed of doubt. What she didn't know was that Mason was already aware of everything, including Ava's secret meeting with Edward Sullivan that day, though neither Ava nor Sullivan knew he knew. He knew. Back at the hospital, Mason found Ava in Tommy's room, explaining his improving condition to Sarah Harper. Watching them together, he felt ashamed for even momentarily doubting her. Everything okay? Ava asked, noting his troubled expression. Emily tried to convince me you've been investigating my hospital, he said directly, deciding honesty was the only path forward. Ava's face showed surprise, then understanding. The financial analysis from last year. I was looking into unusual patterns across several hospitals after noticing irregularities at Mercy. Your hospital was one of many I examined. Why didn't you tell me? Because I never finished the investigation, Ava explained. And after everything you've done for Tommy, I realized I was wrong about Aldridge Medical Center. The numbers might have looked suspicious, but the reality is different. You run things differently than Bennett. Her simple honesty, her willingness to admit she might have judged wrongly, confirmed everything Mason believed about her character. Emily's manipulations had failed not because they weren't clever, but because they couldn't compete with genuine truth. As if reading his thoughts, Ava added softly, No more secrets, okay? Whatever Emily's trying to stir up, we face it together." Mason nodded, taking her hand. Together he agreed, knowing there was still one massive secret waiting to be revealed: her true connection to Edward Sullivan. Detective Morrison spread the Sophie Williams case files across the conference room table at Aldridge Medical Center, each document telling part of a tragic story. Ava sat beside Mason, her hands trembling slightly as she reviewed the evidence of her own destruction. "Walk us through that night again," Morrison requested gently. "Every detail matters now." Ava closed her eyes, remembering. Sophie came in for routine appendicitis. Initial tests were normal. Nothing in her history suggested complications. The surgery went perfectly, but then... Her heart stopped. Mason finished softly, having heard the story in their late-night conversations. "Yes, but it wasn't just cardiac arrest. Her reaction was severe, unexpected. When I checked her charts afterward, someone had added medication orders I never prescribed." But Morrison pulled out a document. "Like this prescription, we had it analyze the signatures and expert forgery, but it's definitely not yours." Sarah Williams, Sophie's mother, sat across the table, tears streaming down her face as the truth emerged. "All this time, we blamed you. The hospital told us you'd made a mistake, that you'd been careless." Mrs. Williams, Ava's voice broke. "I think about Sophie every day. I would never have done anything to harm her." "We know that now," Mr. Williams spoke up from beside his wife. "Detective Morrison showed us the evidence. Bennett and his people, they used our daughter's death to cover their crimes." Rachel Anderson entered with more files, her testimony as head nurse proving crucial to the investigation. "These are all the cases where Bennett altered records. Sophie's wasn't the first, but it was the most devastating." "Because Dr. Harper was getting too close to the truth," Morrison explained, laying out financial documents. "She'd noticed discrepancies in the hospital's billing, started asking questions about missing research funds." Mason studied the timeline they'd constructed. The night before Sophie's surgery, Ava met with a hospital board member anonymously to report her suspicions. Edward Sullivan, Ava confirmed, unaware of the significance. He seemed concerned about the irregularities, promised to investigate. Sarah Harper, who had joined them to support her daughter, gasped softly as she recognized the name. Mason and Morrison exchanged knowing looks, but kept Sullivan's secret for now. "Bennett must have found out about the meeting," Morrison continued. The next day, Sophie Williams was admitted for routine surgery. The perfect opportunity to discredit a whistleblower. "But why kill an innocent child?" Sarah Williams demanded, her grief turning to anger. "They didn't mean to," Rachel explained quietly. "The medication they added to her chart, it was supposed to cause complications, make Ava look incompetent. They didn't expect Sophie's severe reaction." The room fell silent as the full weight of the tragedy sank in. A young girl dead, a doctor's career destroyed, all to protect a web of corruption. "We found this in Bennett's private safe," Morrison said, sliding a document across the table. It was Ava's original report on the financial irregularities, with handwritten notes from Bennett plotting her downfall. "There's more," Mason added. "Emily Winters wasn't just Bennett's accomplice. She was orchestrating similar schemes at other hospitals, creating a network of fraud and cover-ups." Ava picked up Sophie's original chart, her medical training spotting details she'd missed in the chaos of that night. "Look at these test results. They were altered too, but subtly. Someone with extensive medical knowledge had to help Bennett." Dr. James Walker, Morrison confirmed. "Bennett's chief of surgery. He's agreed to testify against them both in exchange for leniency." Sarah Williams reached across the table, taking Ava's hand. "We're dropping all charges against you. And we want to help testify about how the hospital manipulated us into blaming you." Tears filled Ava's eyes. "Mrs. Williams, I'm so sorry about Sophie. Not a day goes by that I don't wish." You tried to save her, Mr. Williams interrupted. And then you tried to expose the corruption that led to her death. We should have known better than to believe their lies about you. Morrison gathered the evidence, preparing to present it to the medical board. Dr. Harper, with your permission, we'd like you to testify as well. Your medical expertise will be crucial in explaining how Bennett's team manipulated these cases. Ava nodded, feeling a weight lifting from her shoulders. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure this never happens to another patient or doctor. Mason watched her with pride, seeing the strength that had drawn him to her from the beginning. This woman, who had lost everything but never lost her integrity, had somehow helped him rediscover his own moral compass. One last thing, Morrison added. Edward Sullivan has requested to be present at your testimony. He says he has additional evidence about the extent of Bennett's crimes. Ava agreed, not knowing she was about to face not just the resurrection of her career, but the revelation of her true identity. Late that night, Mason stood in his penthouse office, staring at the city lights below while wrestling with the weight of secrets. On his desk lay 3 files: Sullivan's proof of paternity, Emily's evidence of his own hospital's financial irregularities, and the complete investigation into Sophie Williams' death. You haven't told her yet, have you? Clara asked from the doorway, bringing him his 3rd coffee of the night. How do you tell someone that their biological father has been watching their entire life? That he knew about their downfall but didn't step in? Mason ran a hand through his disheveled hair. And how do I explain knowing all this while pretending to be her boyfriend? Are you still pretending? Clara's question hung in the air. Mason thought about Ava's strength during the investigation, her compassion for the Williams family despite their years of blame, her unwavering focus on Tommy's recovery even amid her own vindication. No, he admitted quietly. I stopped pretending somewhere between the coffee shop and tonight. Then you have a bigger problem, Clara pointed out. Your feelings are real, but your relationship started with a lie. One that's about to collide with Sullivan's secret. Mason picked up the file about his hospital's finances. Emily wasn't completely lying. There are irregularities in our books too. Nothing like Bennett's fraud, but enough to raise questions. Questions Ava was investigating before Sophie Williams died. What if she can't forgive the deception? Mason voiced his deepest fear. What if finding out about Sullivan, about our arrangement, about these financial issues, what if it's too much? Clara sat down, her maternal instincts taking over. Mason, I've worked with you for 15 years. I watched you rebuild after Emily's betrayal, saw you close yourself off from any real connections. But with Ava, you're different. You're the person you were meant to be before life made you hard. That's what terrifies me, Mason confessed. I built this empire on control, on never letting anyone close enough to hurt me again. Now you're in love with a woman who values truth above all else, and you're keeping life-changing secrets from her. Mason walked to the window, remembering the moment in Tommy's hospital room when Ava had said no more secrets. The irony twisted in his gut. His phone buzzed a text from Sullivan she needs to know before the medical board hearing. Both about me and about your original arrangement. Better she hears it from you than Bennett's lawyers. Another message followed from Detective Morrison. Bennett's team is planning to use your fake relationship to discredit Ava's testimony. Time's running out. Mason pressed his forehead against the cool glass, remembering his father's words from long ago. Son, in medicine and in life, hard truths told with love hurt less than kind lies discovered too late. What would you do, he asked Clara, if you were in my position? I'd remember that Ava Harper has survived losing her career, her reputation, and nearly her brother. She's stronger than you're giving her credit for. And Sullivan? How do I tell her that her biological father watched her fall from grace and did nothing? Tell her everything, Clara said simply. The arrangement, Sullivan's identity, your hospital's issues, and most importantly, how your feelings changed. Let her decide what to do with the truth. Mason nodded slowly, making his decision. He picked up his phone to text Ava, but it rang first the cardiac unit. Tommy's condition had suddenly deteriorated. Racing to the hospital, Mason found Ava in Tommy's room, her medical training warring with her sisterly panic as the doctors worked to stabilize him. Without thinking, he pulled her into his arms. "I can't lose him," she whispered against his chest. "Not now, not when everything's finally being set right." In that moment, holding her while she faced another potential loss, Mason knew he couldn't wait any longer. The truth needed to be told, whatever the consequences. "Ava," he said gently, once Tommy was stable again. "There's something I need to tell you. Several things, actually. About Sullivan, about us, about everything." She looked up at him, her eyes red from crying but clear. "I know about Sullivan being my biological father," she said quietly. "He told me an hour ago." Mason felt the ground shift beneath his feet. "And our arrangement?" "Emily made sure I knew about that too." Ava's voice was tired but not angry. "I've known for days. I was waiting for you to tell me yourself." "Why didn't you say anything?" Ava touched his face gently. "Because somewhere between pretending to fall in love and actually falling in love, the lies became less important than the truth they led us to." The cardiac monitor's steady beeping provided a grim soundtrack as Dr. Sarah Collins delivered the news that would shatter the fragile peace of the previous hours. "Tommy's heart is failing," she explained, her voice gentle but professional. "The experimental treatment helped initially, but his body is showing signs of rejection. Without immediate intervention, we're looking at complete cardiac failure within 48 hours. Ava gripped the edge of Tommy's bed, her medical knowledge making the prognosis even more devastating. She could read the numbers on the monitors, understand exactly what each declining vital sign meant. "What are our options?" Mason asked, his hand steady on Ava's shoulder. "He needs a heart transplant," Dr. Collins stated. "And he needs it now. We've moved him to the top of the regional list, but finding a match in time." "There has to be something else," Sarah Harper pleaded, clutching her son's hand. "Some other treatment, some other hospital." Edward Sullivan, who had been quietly observing from the doorway, stepped forward. "I have connections with every major cardiac center on the East Coast. Let me make some calls." Ava looked at her newly discovered biological father, seeing her own determination reflected in his eyes. "Thank you," she managed, the word carrying the weight of more than just this moment. The next 24 hours became a desperate race against time. Sullivan worked his network of medical contacts while Mason mobilized Aldridge Medical Center's resources. Every cardiac surgeon in the region was alerted. Every potential donor match was evaluated. Tommy drifted in and out of consciousness, each awakening weaker than the last. During one lucid moment, he caught Ava's hand. "Remember when I was 10, he whispered, "and you stayed up all night reading Harry Potter to me in the hospital?" Ava forced a smile through her tears. "You said hospitals weren't so scary if you pretended they were Hogwarts." "You've always been my protector," Tommy continued, his voice fading. "But sometimes you have to let others protect you too." Before Ava could respond, the monitors began screaming. Tommy's heart was going into failure. Dr. Collins and her team rushed in, pushing everyone aside as they fought to stabilize him. "Get me Anne," or Prepped Collins shouted. "We need to put him on bypass immediately." Mason pulled Ava back as the medical team worked, knowing how desperately she wanted to step in and help. She buried her face in his chest, her body shaking. "I can't lose him," she whispered. "He's the reason I survived losing everything else. He believed in me when no one else did." In the operating room, Dr. Collins performed what she later called a medical miracle, managing to stabilize Tommy enough for temporary life support. But it was only buying time. Sarah Harper sat with her children, watching Tommy's chest rise and fall with the help of machines. The strong-willed insurance agent, who had fought so hard for both her children, now seemed lost. "Tell me about the day you brought him home," Ava said suddenly, needing to hear the story again. Sarah smiled through her tears. "You were so excited to be a big sister. Just 6 years old, but you appointed yourself his personal doctor. Drew little medical charts with crayons. And when his heart condition was diagnosed, you promised to become the best doctor in the world to fix him." Sarah touched Ava's cheek. "And you did become an amazing doctor, sweetheart. No matter what Bennett and his lies took from you, they couldn't take that." Sullivan, watching from the doorway again, felt the full weight of his absence in these memories. He tracked Ava's life through reports and photographs, but had missed these intimate moments of family love and courage. Mason returned with coffee and news. "We've expanded the search nationwide. Every cardiac center in the country is looking for a match. And I've arranged for specialists from 3 other hospitals to consult." Ava nodded, Dr. Mode temporarily overriding System Mode. "What about the new anti-rejection protocols? If we can stabilize his current condition." "Already being prepared," Mason assured her. "Dr. Collins is implementing everything we've got." As if summoned by her name, Collins appeared with fresh test results. Her face carried the grave expression medical professionals reserve for their hardest moments. "The bypass isn't going to be enough," she said quietly. "His other organs are starting to show stress. We have maybe 24 hours left to find a donor heart." The words fell like stones in the quiet room. 24 hours to save Tommy's life. 24 hours to find a miracle. Detective Morrison burst into Tommy's hospital room, interrupting the tense vigil with news that would change everything. "We found something in Emily's background check," he announced, his face showing the shock of his discovery. "She's not who we thought she was." Ava looked up from Tommy's bedside, while Mason moved closer, his body tense with anticipation. "Emily Winters died 20 years ago," Morrison continued, spreading documents across the side table. "The real Emily was killed in a car accident with her parents. The woman we know as Emily Winters is actually Catherine Sullivan, Edward Sullivan's adopted daughter." The revelation hit the room like a thunderbolt. Sullivan, who had been quietly making calls in the corner, dropped his phone. "That's impossible," he whispered, his face ashen. "Catherine died in foster care before we could finalize the adoption." "No," Morrison corrected, "she ran away. And then she stole the identity of a dead girl named Emily Winters. We found the original documents in her safety deposit box, along with this." He placed a worn photograph on the table. It showed a younger Edward Sullivan with 2 small girls. One was clearly Ava as a baby, the other a toddler with familiar green eyes. "You were going to adopt both of us?" Ava asked Sullivan, her voice shaking. Sullivan sank into a chair, looking suddenly old. "After your mother died, I couldn't care for a baby alone. But Catherine, she was 4, already in the foster system. I thought if I could adopt her first, prove I could be a good father, they'd let me keep you too. But then she disappeared." "So Emily Catherine is my sister?" Ava's question hung in the air. "Half-sister," Morrison clarified. "Same father, different mothers. She found out about you years ago and has been orchestrating this whole thing, the fraud at Mercy, your downfall, even getting close to Mason. It was all part of her revenge plan." Mason felt the pieces clicking into place. "That's why she targeted my family 15 years ago. She knew about Sullivan's connection to healthcare financing. She was using us all to get back at him." "But why?" Sarah Harper asked, protectively holding Tommy's hand. "Why destroy so many lives just for revenge?" A new voice answered from the doorway. "Because he chose her." Emily, or Catherine, stood there in handcuffs, flanked by FBI agents. Her perfect composure was gone, replaced by raw pain. He chose the precious baby who looked just like her mother over the troubled foster kid who needed him. Catherine Sullivan stood, taking a step toward her. "I looked for you for years. I never stopped trying to find you." Save it, she spat. I watched you track Ava's whole life, celebrate her successes, grieve her failures. Where were you when I was sleeping on streets, when I was fighting to survive? Is that why you targeted me? Ava asked softly. To hurt him. I wanted him to watch his perfect daughter fall, just like I did. Catherine's voice broke. But then I found out about Tommy's condition, about how you sacrificed everything to care for him. You were exactly what I could have been if Sullivan had chosen me. The monitors tracking Tommy's heart rate beeped steadily in the silence that followed. Catherine stared at the boy in the bed, her face showing the first real emotion anyone had seen from her. He needs a heart transplant, she said suddenly. It wasn't a question. How did you know that Mason demanded? Because I've been having him monitored, Catherine admitted. I've known about his condition all along, just like I knew Ava would agree to your fake relationship if it meant helping her brother. Sullivan stepped forward, his voice urgent. Catherine, if you know something about a potential donor. I do. She looked directly at Ava. There's a matching donor heart available at Boston General. I've been keeping the information buried in their system, waiting to use it as leverage. You blocked a donor match. Mason's voice was incredulous. You would let an innocent boy die for your revenge. No, Catherine's shoulders slumped. That's why I came forward. I couldn't become the monster who killed a child. Not like Bennett. Not even to hurt Sullivan. Detective Morrison was already on his phone, coordinating with Boston General. Within minutes, confirmation came through. The heart was a perfect match for Tommy. As the room erupted into action, preparing for emergency transport and surgery, Catherine turned to leave with her FBI escorts. But Ava called after her. Thank you, she said simply, for choosing Tommy's life over your revenge. Catherine paused, not turning around. Take care of our father, she said quietly. He's not perfect, but he tries. That's more than most people get. While Tommy was being prepared for emergency transport to Boston, a different kind of emergency was unfolding in the Aldridge Medical Center boardroom. Richard Bennett, released on bail, had called an emergency board meeting with a single agenda: the hostile takeover of the hospital. Mason Aldridge has compromised this institution, Bennett announced to the gathered board members. His personal involvement with a disgraced doctor, his mishandling of the Mercy investigation, and the irregular financial records Emily Winters exposed all point to one conclusion: he's no longer fit to lead. Clara burst into Mason's office, where he was coordinating Tommy's transfer. They're voting to remove you, she said breathlessly. Bennett convinced enough board members to force an emergency leadership change. Mason glanced at Ava, torn between the two crises. Go, she said firmly. I have Sullivan and Dr. Collins with me. Save your hospital. The boardroom fell silent as Mason entered. Bennett stood at the head of the table, Mason's usual position, a victory smile already playing on his lips. Trying to steal another man's life's work, Bennett Mason's voice was deadly calm. Wasn't destroying Mercy enough for you? This isn't theft, it's salvation, Bennett replied smoothly. Your emotional involvement with Dr. Harper has clouded your judgment. This hospital needs objective leadership. Objective? Mason laughed coldly. Like your objective handling of Sophie Williams' case, or your objective management of Mercy's finances? Those charges are pending, Bennett reminded him. Meanwhile, your own financial irregularities are well documented. Emily Winters provided quite thorough evidence. You mean Catherine Sullivan? Mason watched Bennett's face pale. Yes, we know who she really is. And we know about your long-term collaboration to destroy healthcare institutions for profit. The boardroom erupted in murmurs. Bennett tried to regain control. This is a desperate attempt to deflect from the real issues. The numbers don't lie under Aldridge's leadership. This hospital has shown concerning financial patterns. You're right, Mason agreed, surprising everyone. The numbers don't lie. Which is why I had our entire financial history independently audited last week. He started distributing folders. You'll find that every irregular transaction was actually tracking money we used to provide care for uninsured patients. But the board members began reviewing the documents as Mason continued. Every suspicious pattern Emily found was actually evidence of this hospital fulfilling its true mission, helping people regardless of their ability to pay. A noble sentiment, Bennett sneered, but financially unsustainable. This isn't a charity. No, said a new voice from the doorway. Edward Sullivan stepped in, his presence commanding immediate attention. It's a hospital. Something you seem to have forgotten, Richard. Mr. Sullivan, Bennett's voice wavered slightly. This is a private board meeting. As the potential new majority shareholder, I believe I have the right to attend. Sullivan placed a thick document on the table. My offer to purchase controlling interest in Aldridge Medical Center, contingent on Mason remaining as CEO. The board members' eyes widened at the number on the proposal. Bennett scrambled to recover. The board hasn't approved any sale. They will, Sullivan stated confidently, because unlike your offer, which would strip the hospital's assets and destroy its mission, mine comes with a $5 billion commitment to expanding patient care. Mason watched his board members' faces as they processed this information. These were doctors and administrators he'd chosen specifically for their commitment to healthcare, not just profits. People who understood his vision of what a hospital could be. There's something else you should know, Mason added quietly. While Bennett's been plotting this takeover, my team has been arranging emergency transport for a critical cardiac patient. A 16-year-old boy who would have died if we operated like Bennett's hospitals, caring only about profit margins and bottom lines. The eldest board member, Dr. Margaret Chen, spoke up. I move to reject the leadership challenge and reaffirm Mason Aldridge as CEO. The vote was unanimous. Bennett, his face mottled with rage, moved to leave but found his path blocked by Detective Morrison. Perfect timing, Morrison smiled. Your bail's been revoked. New evidence of witness tampering. As Bennett was led away in handcuffs, Mason turned to Sullivan. Did you really mean that offer? Every penny, Sullivan confirmed. Though I'd like to add one condition: we establish a new cardiac research center named after Tommy Harper. Mason's phone buzzed a message from Ava. The transport team was ready. Tommy's life-saving journey to Boston was about to begin. The Harper Center for Cardiac Innovation, Mason mused. I think Ava would like that. In the private jet rushing Tommy to Boston, Edward Sullivan finally found the moment to share his full story with Ava. Mason sat across from them, holding Tommy's medical charts, but watching the father and daughter intently. Your mother's name was Grace Sullivan, began softly, pulling out a worn photograph. She was a resident at Mass General when I met her, the brightest young surgeon anyone had ever seen. Ava studied the photograph, a beautiful woman in surgical scrubs, her eyes holding the same determination Ava saw in her own mirror. What happened to her? Complications during your birth, Sullivan's voice cracked. She knew the risks. There were problems early in the pregnancy, but she refused to give up on you. Her last words were, making me promise to make sure you became the doctor she knew you could be. But you gave me up, Ava said quietly, no accusation in her voice, just a need to understand. I was a mess after Grace died, young, drowning in grief, barely managing my small investment firm. The Harpers were friends of Grace's family. They'd been trying to have a child for years when they offered. Sullivan paused, collecting himself. I thought they could give you the stable home I couldn't. Sarah Harper, dozing in a nearby seat, stirred at the mention of her name. We never meant to keep him from you, sweetheart. Edward asked for updates, sent birthday gifts through our lawyer. We just didn't know how to tell you. The music box, Ava remembered suddenly. The one that played Claire de Lune every birthday until I turned 18. Sullivan nodded. Grace used to play it on the piano. She said it was the perfect tempo for surgical sutures. I practiced my first stitches to that song, Ava whispered. On oranges in my room. I always felt closer to my birth mother when I did. The medical equipment monitoring Tommy beeped steadily, providing a rhythm to their revelations. Mason pretended to study the charts, giving them privacy while remaining close enough to support Ava if needed. When you got into medical school, Sullivan continued, I wanted to reach out, but you were thriving with the Harpers. I told myself watching from afar was better than disrupting your life. And during the Sophie Williams case, Ava's question held no bitterness, only curiosity. Sullivan's face showed deep pain, my biggest regret. I was gathering evidence against Bennett, trying to clear your name legally, but it took too long. By the time I had proof, the damage was done. That's why you arranged the dinner with Mason, Ava realized. You wanted to see me, to help, but couldn't reveal yourself yet. I didn't expect you two to actually fall in love, Sullivan admitted, glancing at Mason with a hint of a smile. That complicated things considerably. Mason looked up from the charts. In the best possible way, he said softly, his eyes meeting Ava's. Tommy's monitors chirped, drawing everyone's attention. His vital signs remained stable, but time was precious. The pilot announced their descent into Boston, where a surgical team waited. There's something else you should know, Sullivan said quickly. About your mother's family inheritance. Grace came from old money, but her family disowned her for becoming a doctor instead of marrying their chosen suitor. When she died, she left everything to you in a trust, to be revealed when you turned 35. Ava shook her head, overwhelmed. I don't care about money. I wish I'd known her. Known you. You're more like her than you know, Sullivan smiled sadly. She would have done exactly what you did, at mercy standing up for patients regardless of the personal cost. And she would have been so proud of the doctor you became. The jet landed smoothly, and the next few minutes were a blur of activity as Tommy was transferred to the waiting ambulance. Before they left the plane, Sullivan caught Ava's hand. I can't change the past, he said, but if you'll let me, I'd like to be part of your future. Both of yours, he added, including Tommy in his gaze. Ava looked at her sleeping brother, then at Mason, and finally at the man who had given her life but had been a shadow in it until now. I think she said carefully that Tommy could use another grandfather, and I could use a father. The corridors of Boston General Hospital erupted into chaos at 3 a.m. Tommy Harper had vanished from the pre-op ward, his bed empty except for a single note, a life for a life. Now you know how it feels to lose everything. Ava stood in the doorway of the empty room, her body rigid with shock. The monitors that should have been tracking her brother's failing heart beeped uselessly beside the vacant bed. Mason held her steady as Detective Morrison examined the scene. The security cameras were disabled professionally, Morrison reported grimly. But we have a witness. A nurse saw Emily, or rather Catherine, in scrubs leaving through the service entrance. She had hospital credentials. Sullivan paced the room, his face ashen. This is my fault. I should have known she'd try something like this. She's punishing me through both my daughters. We have 40 minutes, Dr. Collins interjected, checking her watch. The donor heart is already in transit. If we don't perform the transplant within that window, Tommy won't survive. Ava's medical training warred with her panic. He needs his anti-rejection medications. Without them, even if she doesn't mean to hurt him. She's not thinking rationally, Mason finished. This isn't about Tommy. It's about making you feel what she felt being powerless while someone you love is taken away. A young orderly burst into the room. Dr. Harper. We found this at the nurse's station. He handed over a phone, Tommy's phone. On the screen was a text message, remember the music box, where Grace used to play piano. The conservatory, Sullivan breathed. Grace taught piano at the Boston Conservatory before medical school. Catherine must have found out. Morrison was already mobilizing his team, but Ava grabbed his arm. No sirens, no police. She'll panic. She's not just my sister, she's a cornered woman who spent 20 years planning revenge. Let me go alone. Not alone, Mason said firmly, taking her hand. I'm coming too, Sullivan started, but Ava shook her head. You're the one she really wants to hurt. Stay here, coordinate with the surgical team. We'll bring Tommy back in time. The drive to the conservatory took 7 precious minutes. The grand old building stood dark and silent, but a faint light flickered from the recital hall windows. Inside, they found Catherine sitting at a grand piano, Tommy unconscious on a makeshift bed beside her. Her fingers moved over the keys, playing Claire de Lune. He's sedated, she said without looking up. The same thing they gave me in foster care when I got too difficult to handle. Catherine, Ava said softly, taking a step forward. He's just a boy. Like you were just a girl when you needed family the most. Funny how history repeats. Catherine's fingers never stopped moving across the keys. A dying child, a desperate sister, a father who has to choose which daughter to save. No one has to choose, Mason spoke up. There's room for healing here. For everyone. Catherine's hands crashed onto the keys, the discordant sound echoing through the hall. Healing. Do you know what it's like to watch someone else living the life that should have been yours? To see her become the doctor, the beloved daughter, while you survived, Ava finished. You built yourself up from nothing. Became brilliant and successful. Even if you used it for revenge, that strength, it's yours, not his, not mine. The music stopped. In the silence, Tommy stirred slightly, his breathing labored. He has maybe 20 minutes, Catherine said quietly. The donor heart is waiting. Are you feeling it yet, sister? The helplessness? The knowledge that someone else controls whether your loved one lives or dies. Mason took a careful step forward, positioning himself between the sisters. Catherine, you want Sullivan to feel the pain of choosing between his daughters? Make me choose instead. Both women turned to him in confusion. Catherine's hand stilled on the piano keys. My life for Tommy's, Mason said clearly. You want revenge? Take it on me. I'm the one who betrayed you 15 years ago, who never saw through your Emily Winters disguise. Let Tommy go, and you can have control of Aldridge Medical Center. Mason, no, Ava whispered, but he continued. Full control, no board oversight. Everything I've built, everything I am, it's yours. Just let him get to that operating room. Catherine studied him, her fingers absently tracing the piano's ivory keys. You'd give up your life's work? For her. For them both, Mason answered. Because 15 years ago I let bitterness over your betrayal turn me into someone who cared more about success than people. I won't make that mistake again. He pulled out his phone, already displaying a prepared document. One signature, and it's all yours. My resignation, my voting shares, everything. You can destroy my reputation, dismantle everything I've built. Just give Tommy a chance to live. The hall fell silent except for Tommy's labored breathing. Catherine stood slowly, moving away from the piano. You really love her that much? Enough to become the man her father is someone who'd sacrifice everything for his children. Tears slipped down Catherine's cheeks. I wanted him to hurt like I hurt. But you're choosing to give up everything. She looked at Tommy, then at Ava. That's what a real father would do. Yes, Mason said softly. It is. Catherine's shoulders slumped. Get him to the hospital, she whispered. Hurry. As Ava rushed to Tommy, Mason stepped closer to Catherine. The offer stands, he said quietly. Not as blackmail, but as restitution. What I built, it came from the ashes of your first revenge. Maybe you can use it better than I did. Catherine shook her head, suddenly looking very young and tired. Keep your hospital, Mason. Just take care of my sister. And tell our father. She paused as police sirens wailed in the distance. Tell him I understand now. Sometimes love means letting go. Morrison's team burst in as Mason and Ava carried Tommy to the waiting ambulance. Catherine made no attempt to resist arrest, her eyes following her siblings until they disappeared from view. In the ambulance, racing back to Boston General with lights flashing, Ava gripped Mason's hand. "You would have really given it all up." In a heartbeat, Mason replied, helping the paramedics stabilize Tommy. "Some things matter more than empire building. Like family. Like love." He met her eyes in the flashing lights. "Like becoming someone worthy of the second chance you've given me." The emergency entrance of Boston General erupted into controlled chaos as Tommy was rushed through the doors. Dr. Collins met them with grim news: the donor heart is showing signs of deterioration. "We have maybe 10 minutes before it's no longer viable." The surgical team moved with practiced urgency, but complications arose immediately. Tommy's vital signs were crashing, his system reacting badly to the sedative Catherine had given him. BP dropping, a nurse called out. "We're losing him." Ava stepped forward instinctively, her doctor's training taking over. His medication allergies. Did anyone check if the sedative she used could interact with his heart medication? Dr. Collins's eyes widened. "Get me a tox screen now and start preparing the counter-agents." The next few minutes became a desperate race. The surgical team worked to stabilize Tommy while the donor heart's viability clock ticked down. Mason coordinated with the hospital administration, clearing every bureaucratic hurdle with ruthless efficiency. "The organ's ready," a nurse announced, "but his numbers aren't stable enough for surgery." Sullivan paced the corridor, making rapid-fire calls to every medical expert in his network. Sarah Harper sat quietly praying, her hand clutching her son's medical history like a lifeline. "We can't wait," Dr. Collins decided. "If we don't start now, we'll lose both Tommy and the donor heart." The risk of him not surviving the procedure, Ava began, her medical knowledge now a torture, "is still better than the certainty of losing him if we don't try." Mason finished, holding her steady. The doors to the surgical wing swung open, and the team began moving Tommy toward the oar. At the last moment, Dr. Collins turned to Ava. "We could use another set of skilled hands in there," she said quietly. "Your medical license may be suspended, but this is a family emergency. I'll take full responsibility." Ava froze, torn between her sister's instinct to stay close and her doctor's training that could help save him. Mason squeezed her hand. "Go," he whispered. "Be who you were always meant to be." The next 3 hours were the most intense of Ava's medical career. Working alongside Dr. Collins, she found her surgical skills returning as if she'd never left the oar. Every suture, every careful movement was accompanied by the music box melody playing in her head, Claire de Lune, her mother's legacy guiding her hands. Outside, Mason and Sullivan maintained their vigil. The hospital staff, hearing the story, brought coffee and support. Even Catherine, under police guard in another wing, sent a message through her lawyer, a detailed list of everything she'd given Tommy, helping the medical team counteract the sedatives. Finally, Dr. Collins emerged, her surgical mask still in place. The waiting room fell silent. "He's stable," she announced. "The new heart is beating strongly." Dr. Harper's knowledge of his medical history and her surgical skills made the difference. The tension broke. Sarah Harper burst into tears of relief. Sullivan hugged Mason, both men unashamed of their own tears. But their joy was interrupted by a hospital administrator rushing in with urgent news. "The medical board is here," he announced. "They're saying Dr. Harper performed surgery with a suspended license. They're threatening to shut down the entire transplant program for protocol violations." The media circus descended on Boston General within hours. News vans clogged the parking lot, reporters jostling for position as the story broke. Disgraced doctor performs illegal surgery, hospital faces shut down over protocol breach, medical board demands investigation. Inside the hospital's administrative offices, the medical board's emergency panel faced off against an unexpected alliance. Mason stood at the center, flanked by Sullivan, Dr. Collins, and the hospital's legal team. "Let me understand this," the board chairman said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You allowed a suspended physician to perform heart transplant surgery on her own brother, violating at least 15 protocols." "I allowed a uniquely qualified surgeon to assist in saving a child's life," Dr. Collins countered, "a decision I would make again." With all due respect, another board member interjected, "This isn't just about one surgery. This incident has exposed serious oversight issues. The entire transplant program could lose certification." Mason stepped forward. "Before you make any decisions, you should review these files." He placed a thick folder on the table. Complete documentation of Dr. Bennett's conspiracy against Dr. Harper, including his confession and Emily Winter's, or rather, Catherine Sullivan's testimony. The board members began reviewing the evidence as Sullivan added his own voice. "My investigators have uncovered a pattern of corruption that reaches into this very board. Members who were pressured or bribed to revoke Dr. Harper's license without proper investigation." The chairman's face paled as he recognized certain documents. "These allegations are serious." "They're not allegations," Detective Morrison said, entering the room. "They're evidence in an ongoing federal investigation. And right now, every decision this board makes is being scrutinized for signs of continued corruption." Outside the office, reporters had cornered Sarah Harper, hoping for emotional sound bites about her children. Instead, they found themselves facing a mother's fierce defense. "My daughter saved her brother's life," she told the cameras firmly. "If that's a scandal, then maybe we need to re-examine our priorities as a society." The story began to shift as more details emerged. Public opinion, initially critical, turned as people learned about Bennett's conspiracy, Catherine's redemption, and a sister's desperate fight to save her brother. Social media exploded with Justice for Draper trending nationwide. Inside Tommy's recovery room, Ava sat unaware of the storm raging around her, focused only on her brother's steady vital signs. The new heart was beating strongly, each beep of the monitor a small victory. Mason entered quietly, his face showing the strain of battle. "The board's deliberating. Sullivan's lawyers are presenting your case." "I don't regret it," Ava said softly, not looking up from Tommy. "Even if they permanently revoke my license, even if they press charges, I'd do it again." "They won't," Mason assured her. "Catherine sent over her full confession about the Sophie Williams case. Bennett's facing additional charges for tampering with evidence during your original hearing. The truth is finally coming out." Tommy stirred slightly, his first movements in surgery. Ava leaned forward, doctor and sister merged in one anxious motion. "The press is calling it the medical scandal of the decade," Mason continued, moving to stand behind her. "But not for the reasons the board expected. People are asking how many other doctors have been wrongly accused, how many lives were affected by corruption in the system." "I never wanted to be the face of medical reform," Ava sighed. "Sometimes the best advocates are the ones who never sought the role," Mason replied, squeezing her shoulder. "Your father's already talking about establishing a legal fund for wrongly accused medical professionals." Outside the window, they could see the crowd of reporters growing, the story building momentum. But in this quiet room, watching Tommy's peaceful recovery, none of that seemed to matter. "Whatever happens next," Mason said softly, "we face it together." The visiting room at the county detention center was stark and cold, but Catherine Sullivan sat with perfect posture, her prison jumpsuit worn like designer clothing. Across the table, Edward Sullivan and Ava waited as she gathered her thoughts. "I should start at the beginning," Catherine said, her voice steady. "The real beginning, not the Emily Winters story everyone knows." She described a lonely child in foster care, watching her would-be father build a financial empire while she struggled to survive, how she discovered Ava's existence, tracked her progress through medical school, and began plotting a revenge that would span decades. I became Emily Winters because she was everything I wasn't: wealthy, privileged, connected. The perfect tool to destroy both Mason's family, and eventually yours, Catherine's eyes met Ava's. But I never meant for Sophie Williams to die. Tell us what really happened, Sullivan encouraged gently. Bennett approached me about helping him cover up financial fraud at Mercy. I suggested using targeted scandals to distract from the missing money. When Ava started investigating the discrepancies, Catherine paused, emotion finally cracking her composure. It was perfect. Too perfect. Discrediting her would hurt Sullivan, destroy Mason's faith in people, and cover Bennett's tracks. But Sophie's death wasn't part of the plan, Ava finished quietly. Catherine shook her head, tears falling. We just wanted to create a minor complication, something that would question your competence. Bennett added the extra medication without telling me. By the time I found out, it was too late. And Tommy Sullivan asked, "What made you save him in the end?" Watching Ava with him. It was like seeing myself with my foster brother all those years ago. The one person who believed in me, who needed me. Catherine wiped her eyes. I couldn't let another child die for my revenge. She pulled out a thick envelope. This is everything. Every document, every recording, every person involved in the conspiracy, including board members who took bribes, administrators who falsified records, everyone. Why now? Ava asked softly. Because Mason was willing to give up everything to save Tommy. Because you never stopped being a doctor even when they took your license. Because Catherine looked at Sullivan. Because I finally understood that being a father means making impossible choices, and sometimes those choices break your heart. Sullivan reached across the table, taking his eldest daughter's hand. I should have looked harder for you. Should have fought the system that took you away. I know, Catherine whispered. I know that now. Ava watched them, seeing the shadows of what might have been, what could still be. What happens next? I'm pleading guilty, Catherine said firmly, to everything except Sophie's death. The prosecutors offered a deal in exchange for my testimony against Bennett and the others. How long? Sullivan's voice cracked. 10 years minimum security. With a chance for early release if Catherine hesitated, looking at Ava. If my sister thinks I've truly changed. The word sister hung in the air between them, fragile and hopeful. I'd like to visit, Ava said carefully. Maybe bring Tommy when he's stronger. He'd want to thank the aunt who helped save his life. Catherine's careful composure finally broke completely. I'd like that she managed through tears. I'd like that very much. As their visiting time ended, Catherine stood to leave but turned back one last time. Mason was right, about love being stronger than revenge. I wish I'd learned that lesson sooner. Detective Morrison spread the new evidence across the conference table at the medical board's emergency session. Security camera footage, pharmacy logs, electronic signature timestamps, each piece meticulously documenting the conspiracy against Ava Harper. This footage shows Dr. Bennett entering the hospital pharmacy at 11:42 p.m., the night before Sophie Williams' surgery, Morrison explained, playing the enhanced video. Note the prescription pad in his hand, the same one used to forge Dr. Harper's signature. Rachel Anderson, now the state's key witness, stood trembling but determined. I watched him alter the medication orders. He threatened my job, my license, my family if I ever spoke up. The board members shifted uncomfortably as more evidence mounted. Digital forensics had recovered deleted emails between Bennett and hospital administrators discussing how to use Sophie's case to silence Ava's investigation into their financial fraud. Most damning, Morrison continued, is this recording from Bennett's own office. He played an audio file where Bennett and others clearly discussed framing Ava for Sophie's death. Sarah Williams, Sophie's mother, took the podium next. Her testimony had helped convict Ava. Now she was here to help clear her name. My daughter died because of greed and corruption, she said, her voice breaking. Dr. Harper tried to save her. We blamed an innocent woman while the real criminals walked free. The pharmacy records revealed the truth about Sophie's fatal reaction. Bennett had ordered a dangerous combination of medications, knowing the interaction could be fatal. He'd counted on Ava's reputation for thoroughness working against her. No one would believe she'd make such a basic mistake. The electronic signatures show clear manipulation, the forensics expert testified. The timestamps prove Dr. Harper couldn't have written those orders. She was in surgery with another patient when they were entered. Mason, sitting beside Ava, squeezed her hand as years of carefully constructed lies unraveled. Each piece of evidence vindicated her more completely than the last. Dr. Collins presented Tommy's successful transplant surgery as final proof of Ava's medical expertise. Under extreme pressure, with her brother's life at stake, Dr. Harper demonstrated exceptional surgical skill and judgment. These are not the actions of a careless or incompetent physician. The board chairman looked increasingly uncomfortable as Catherine's detailed confession was read into the record. Her testimony outlined how they'd manipulated evidence, pressured witnesses, and orchestrated Ava's downfall. In light of this overwhelming evidence, the chairman finally announced, "This board has no choice but to fully reinstate Dr. Ava Harper's medical license, with our sincerest apologies for our role in this injustice." Ava sat still, tears streaming down her face as her professional identity was restored. 5 years of shame, doubt, and loss lifted from her shoulders. Furthermore, the chairman continued, "We recommend a full review of all cases handled by Dr. Bennett and his associates. If one innocent doctor was targeted, there may be others." Outside the hearing room, reporters gathered as Ava emerged vindicated, but she stopped only long enough to make one statement. "Today isn't about my redemption. It's about every patient who suffered because corruption was allowed to flourish in our healthcare system. It's about every medical professional who's been silenced for trying to speak the truth. And most importantly, it's about Sophie Williams, whose death must lead to real change in how we protect both patients and physicians." In the quiet of his study at the Sullivan Mansion, Edward Sullivan finally shared the complete story of his past with both his daughters. Catherine had been granted a supervised visit, and she sat beside Ava as their father opened an old leather portfolio. "I met your mother, Grace, when I was a struggling medical student," he began, showing them a faded photograph of a young couple at a hospital fundraiser. "She was brilliant, already making waves in the surgical department despite being the youngest resident." He pulled out newspaper clippings chronicling Grace's groundbreaking work in pediatric surgery. She believed healthcare should be accessible to everyone. She used to run free clinics in underprivileged neighborhoods, treating children whose families couldn't afford care. "That's why you've been funding children's hospitals," Ava realized. "You're continuing her work." Sullivan nodded. "When Grace got pregnant with you, Ava, her family threatened to cut her off completely. They couldn't accept their daughter choosing medicine over marriage to their chosen suitor. But she never wavered." Catherine listened intently as Sullivan described Grace's difficult pregnancy, her refusal to terminate despite the risks, her determination to give her child a chance at life. "After she died," Sullivan's voice cracked, "I was lost. My medical career ended. I couldn't step into a hospital without seeing her everywhere. I turned to finance instead, building my company while trying to numb the pain." He turned to Catherine. "Then I heard about a bright young girl in foster care who needed a home. You reminded me so much of Grace, that same fire, that determination. I thought maybe I could heal by helping another child." "But the adoption fell through," Catherine whispered. "The authorities found out about my depression, my drinking. They deemed me unfit." Sullivan's hands shook as he showed them the rejected adoption papers. "By the time I got myself together, you had disappeared." "And Ava?" Catherine asked. "The Harpers were Grace's colleagues. They knew her, understood her passion for medicine. When they offered to adopt Ava, I thought." He paused, collecting himself. "I thought at least one of my daughters would have the stable home I couldn't provide." Ava studied a photo of her mother in surgical scrubs, seeing her own features reflected back. But you never stopped watching over us. I tracked every scholarship, every achievement. When you followed Grace's path into surgery, Ava, I was so proud. And Catherine, when I discovered you'd become successful in finance, I wanted to reach out. But I was a coward, afraid my presence would only cause more pain. He pulled out more recent documents, records of anonymous donations to children's hospitals, funding for medical research, support for foster care reform. Everything I've built has been trying to honor Grace's memory and make up for failing both of you. The hospitals that provide free care to children, the scholarships for medical students from disadvantaged backgrounds, the foster care advocacy programs, it's all been for my daughters. Catherine touched the papers tentatively. The foster care reform initiative. That was you. We used to dream about changing the system in my group home. Every child deserves a family, Sullivan said softly. I just wish I'd fought harder to keep mine together. The three sat in emotional silence, years of pain and missed connections hanging between them. Finally, Ava spoke. We can't change the past, she said, taking both Catherine's and Sullivan's hands, but maybe we can build something new together. At Tommy's follow-up appointment, Mason gathered Ava and her family in his private office. His face was tense as he pulled out a file he'd kept locked away for 5 years. There's something I need to confess, he began, his voice heavy with guilt. I knew about the conspiracy against you long before we met. In fact, I was inadvertently part of it. The room fell silent as Mason spread documents across his desk. 5 years ago, Bennett approached Aldridge Medical Center about a partnership. During due diligence, we discovered financial irregularities at Mercy. I was the one who first flagged the suspicious patterns. Ava sat very still, her hand finding Tommy's. Go on. When I raised concerns, Bennett told me about a problematic doctor who was investigating their finances. He didn't name you, but he suggested that if this doctor was discredited, the merger could proceed smoothly. Mason's hands shook as he continued. I didn't approve any direct action, but I looked the other way, told myself it was just hospital politics. Then Sophie Williams died, and I realized what my silence had enabled. You knew Ava's voice was barely a whisper. All this time. I killed the merger immediately, Mason said quickly. Started my own investigation. But by then the damage was done. Your career was destroyed and I was a coward. I couldn't face what my inaction had caused. Sullivan leaned forward. That's why you agreed to help when I suggested the dinner arrangement. You were trying to make amends. Yes, Mason admitted. When I saw your name on the guest list, I recognized you from the case files. I thought I could help somehow, make things right. I never expected to fall in love. Sarah Harper stood up, anger flashing in her eyes. You watched my daughter suffer for 5 years, watched her struggle to support Tommy, and you said nothing. Mum, Ava interrupted softly. Let him finish. Mason pulled out one last document, a letter of resignation he'd prepared. I don't expect forgiveness, but you deserve to know everything. The night you performed Tommy's surgery, I was prepared to sacrifice my entire hospital to protect you from the medical board. Not out of guilt, but because somewhere along the way, making amends became less important than loving you. Tears streamed down Ava's face as she processed this final revelation. All those times you helped us, was it just guilt? At first, Mason admitted. But Ava, you have to believe me, everything that happened between us was real. My feelings for you, for Tommy, for your family, that's more real than anything in my life. Tommy, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. He saved my life, Ava. Not just with the surgery, but all those times he helped with medical bills, got me into trials, found specialists. A lifetime of good deeds doesn't erase past mistakes, Mason said quietly. I'll resign from the hospital board. Sullivan can take control. I needed you to know the whole truth. Ava stood and walked to the window, her back to the room. Everyone waited in tense silence for her response. Finally, she turned. 5 years ago, a man's silence helped destroy my life. Today, a man's courage to speak the truth, knowing he might lose everything. That means something. She walked back to Mason, taking his resignation letter and tearing it in half. We've all made mistakes. We've all looked the other way when we should have spoken up. What matters is what we do next. Mason looked up at her, hope warring with guilt in his eyes. What do we do next? We build something better, Ava said firmly. Together. A healthcare system that protects whistleblowers, that puts patients before profits, that helps families like mine heal. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters as Richard Bennett was led away in handcuffs. The jury had deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning their verdict guilty on all counts, including criminal negligence resulting in death, conspiracy, fraud, and witness tampering. Inside, Ava sat between Mason and Sullivan, watching as the judge delivered the sentence. 25 years without possibility of parole, plus full restitution to all victims of the fraud scheme. Furthermore, the judge announced, her voice carrying through the hushed courtroom, I am ordering a complete audit of every case Dr. Bennett influenced during his tenure at Mercy Children's Hospital. Any medical professional whose career was impacted by his actions may petition for review and compensation. The Sophie Williams family sat in the front row, finally at peace with the truth about their daughter's death. Mrs. Williams turned to Ava, tears streaming down her face. She would have wanted this justice that protects other children, other doctors. Outside, Detective Morrison briefed the press. Today's verdict sends a clear message: corruption in healthcare will not be tolerated. Dr. Harper's case has exposed systemic problems that we're now addressing at every level. The medical board's public apology to Ava made headlines nationwide. Beyond reinstating her license, they established the Harper-Williams Protocol, new guidelines for investigating medical incidents that protected both patients and healthcare providers from fraudulent accusations. Catherine received a reduced sentence in recognition of her cooperation. From her minimum security facility, she helped investigators unravel similar schemes at other hospitals, leading to a wave of reforms across the healthcare industry. Sullivan channeled his resources into establishing a legal defense fund for medical whistleblowers. No healthcare professional should ever fear reporting wrongdoing, he announced at the launch. And no family should suffer like the Williams family did. At Aldridge Medical Center, Mason implemented sweeping changes. Every financial transaction was made transparent. Every patient complaint thoroughly investigated. The hospital became a model for ethical healthcare management. The real victory, Ava told reporters after the verdict, isn't just Bennett's conviction. It's the changes his crimes have inspired. New protections for patients, support for medical professionals who speak up, reforms that will save lives. Tommy, now fully recovered from his transplant, stood beside his sister at the press conference. His story of nearly dying while corrupt officials blocked access to care had become a rallying cry for healthcare reform. Rachel Anderson, the nurse who finally spoke up, received the first whistleblower protection grant from Sullivan's fund. Truth shouldn't require courage, she said at the ceremony. It should be the foundation of everything we do in healthcare. The judge's final words echoed through the medical community: healthcare is built on trust. When that trust is betrayed for profit, the damage goes beyond individual victims. It undermines the entire system that saves lives daily. Today's verdict repairs some of that damage and sets us on a path to restore that sacred trust. As Bennett was led away, he turned one last time toward Ava. I'm sorry, he said quietly, for everything. Ava nodded once, accepting his apology but not letting it erase the years of pain he'd caused. Justice wasn't about revenge, it was about making sure such abuse of power could never happen again. Outside the courthouse, sunlight broke through the clouds as Ava hugged her family, both birth and chosen. Sullivan, Mason, Sarah Harper, Tommy, and even Catherine via phone call from her facility. Each had played a part in exposing the truth and creating positive change from tragedy. "Ready to go back to work?" Mason asked softly, as the crowd dispersed. "More than ready," Ava replied. "We have a lot of healing to do, patients and the healthcare system itself." On Christmas Eve, the Sullivan mansion came alive with a gathering that would have seemed impossible months earlier. The grand dining room hosted an unlikely family reunion, bringing together fragments of lives that had been broken and rebuilt. Tommy, now thriving with his new heart, helped Sarah Harper decorate the massive Christmas tree. Edward Sullivan watched from his armchair, marveling at how his grandson's laughter filled the once-empty house with joy. "The decorations are a bit crooked on that side." Catherine's voice came through the tablet propped on a nearby table. She'd been granted special permission to video call during the holidays from her facility. "Then you'll have to come fix them next year," Ava replied, adjusting the ornaments as her sister directed. The easy banter between them still surprised everyone who knew their history. Mason entered carrying dessert, having insisted on making his mother's apple pie recipe himself. "First Christmas together," he said softly to Ava. "All of us." Sarah Harper and Sullivan sat together, sharing stories about Grace, each filling in pieces of the woman they'd both loved, one as a friend and colleague, the other as the love of his life. She would have loved this, Sullivan said, watching his daughters work together even through a screen, her family whole again, plus some wonderful additions she never got to meet. "Speaking of additions," Mason said, taking Ava's hand, "we have an announcement." The room fell silent as Mason and Ava shared their news they were getting married, but with a unique twist. The ceremony would be held at the newly established Harper Williams Children's Wing at Aldridge Medical Center, with all proceeds from the event going to the Patient Care Fund. And Ava added, looking at Catherine's image on the screen, "We'd like you to be my maid of honor. They'll grant you a day release for the ceremony." Catherine's careful composure cracked. "But after everything I did." "You're my sister," Ava said simply. "Besides, who better to help plan a wedding than someone who orchestrated a decade-long revenge scheme? Those organizational skills shouldn't go to waste." The laughter that followed was healing, transforming past pain into shared joy. Tommy, who had been unusually quiet, spoke up. "Does this mean I get 3 sets of parents now? Birth mom and dad, adoptive mom and stepdad?" "It means," Sarah Harper answered, pulling him close, "that you have more people to love you than any kid could dream of." Sullivan raised his glass. "To family, the ones we're born to, the ones who raise us, and the ones we choose along the way." As they gathered around the dinner table, the conversation flowed naturally between medical cases, hospital management, Catherine's prison reform initiatives, and Tommy's college plans to become a cardiologist. "Next Christmas," Catherine promised, "I'll be there in person. My review board hearing is in June, and with good behavior." "We'll save you a seat," Sullivan assured her. "Right between your sisters." The evening ended with an impromptu piano recital. Sullivan played Claire de Lune, Grace's favorite piece, while Ava and Catherine hummed along, connected across distance by their mother's music. Mason watched his future wife with her blended, complicated, beautiful family, remembering how a fake relationship arranged for a business dinner had led to this moment of genuine love and healing. As the last notes faded, Sarah Harper wiped away tears. "Grace would be so proud," she said to Sullivan. "Of all of them?" "We did good," Sullivan replied, including her in the pride of parenthood. "Not perfectly, but good." Through the tablet screen, Catherine watched her family, the one she'd tried to destroy and ended up helping heal. "Merry Christmas," she whispered, touching the screen as Tommy blew her a kiss. To new beginnings, Mason raised his glass again, holding Ava close. To family, everyone echoed the word, carrying the weight of forgiveness, hope, and love. The inauguration of the Harper Williams Center for Medical Ethics drew healthcare professionals from across the country. The gleaming new facility, built on the grounds of Aldridge Medical Center, represented everything Ava and Mason had fought to achieve. Dr. Ava Harper Aldridge, as she was now known, stood at the podium, her surgical scrubs replaced by a professional suit. This center, she began, is more than just a building. It's a promise to every healthcare provider and patient that truth will always have a home here. The audience included faces from every chapter of her journey. Rachel Anderson, now heading the center's whistleblower protection program, the Williams family, who had turned their tragedy into a force for positive change, and medical students eager to learn from her experience. 5 years ago, I lost everything because I dared to question a corrupt system, Ava continued. Today, we're building a system that encourages questions, that protects those who speak up, that puts patients before profits. Mason joined her at the podium to announce the center's first initiative, a comprehensive review board for medical professionals facing disciplinary action, ensuring fair hearings and thorough investigations. No doctor, nurse, or healthcare worker should fear losing their career for doing what's right, he declared. The Harper Williams Center will stand as a shield for truth and integrity in medicine. Through a secure video link, Catherine delivered a guest lecture on recognizing and reporting financial fraud in healthcare institutions. Her insights from the other side of corruption proved invaluable for the center's ethics training program. The afternoon session featured Tommy, now a second-year medical student, sharing his perspective as both a patient and future doctor. His story of nearly dying while bureaucracy blocked his care had become a powerful case study in medical ethics. Sullivan announced a permanent endowment for the center, ensuring its independence from hospital politics. This facility will answer only to truth and ethics, he promised. No influence, no pressure, no compromise. Dr. Collins, who had supported Ava through Tommy's surgery, became the center's first chief of surgical ethics. Together with Ava, she developed new protocols for handling suspected medical misconduct. Today marks my full return to surgery, Ava revealed at the closing ceremony. But more importantly, it marks a new chapter in healthcare. Every patient who enters our hospitals, every professional who dedicates their life to healing, will know they're protected by the principles we establish here. The center's first cases arrived within weeks. A nurse from Seattle facing retaliation for reporting safety violations, a doctor in Miami struggling with an ethical dilemma over patient care, a medical student witnessing suspicious practices during rotation. Each case was handled with the thoroughness and integrity that had been missing from Ava's own ordeal. The center's investigations led to policy changes, corporate reforms, and most importantly, justice for those who had been wronged. This is what healing looks like, Ava told her ethics class, consisting of both medical students and practicing professionals, not just treating physical ailments, but curing the systemic diseases that threaten healthcare itself. As she finished her first surgery since reinstatement, a complex pediatric procedure, the observation deck was full of supporters. Mason, Sullivan, Salah Harper, and even Catherine via tablet, all watching as Ava reclaimed her place in the operating room. The Harper Williams Center, she said later to reporters, proves that from the darkest moments can come the brightest lights. We're not just rebuilding careers here, we're rebuilding trust in the entire medical profession. 1 year after the Harper Williams Center's opening, the Aldridge Medical Center's rooftop garden hosted a celebration that marked not just professional success, but personal triumph. Tommy, now thriving in medical school, danced with his sister at her wedding reception. Ava's white dress caught the setting sun as Mason led her through their first dance to the gentle strains of Claire de Lune, played live by Sullivan on the grand piano he had brought to the rooftop. Catherine, granted release for good behavior and her contributions to healthcare reform, stood proudly as maid of honor. Her speech moved everyone to tears as she spoke about redemption, forgiveness, and the healing power of truth. My sister and Mason taught me that love isn't about winning or losing, she said, her voice steady. It's about choosing to be better, to do better, every single day. Sarah Harper watched her children, both the ones she'd raised and the ones who'd joined her family through love's strange paths, with profound joy. Sullivan stood beside her, finally at peace with the choices that had shaped all their lives. The guest list told the story of their journey. Dr. Collins, who had believed in Ava when few others did. Rachel Anderson, whose courage helped expose the truth. The Williams family, who had turned their grief into a force for positive change. "Look around," Mason said in his toast, holding Ava close. "Every person here represents a choice between fear and courage, between hiding and speaking up, between giving up and fighting on. We choose courage, we choose truth, we choose love." The Harper Williams Center had already helped dozens of healthcare professionals face ethical challenges. Its success sparked similar programs nationwide, creating a network of support for those who dared to stand up against corruption. Tommy's medical school acceptance speech became required viewing in the center's ethics classes. "My sister lost everything because she refused to look away from wrongdoing. But in losing her career, she found her calling, making sure no other doctor faces that choice alone." As the reception continued, Ava slipped away to the quiet corner where her mother's portrait hung in the garden. Mason found her there, contemplating Grace's smile. "She would be proud," he said softly, wrapping his arms around his wife, "of everything you've built from the ashes of what you lost." "Not just me," Ava corrected, turning to face him. "We all built this, you, me, Catherine, Tommy, our parents. Even Bennett's crimes led to something good in the end." They rejoined their guests as Sullivan announced one final surprise: the establishment of the Grace Harper Memorial Scholarship for Ethical Leadership in Medicine, ensuring that their story would inspire generations to come. Catherine revealed her own news. She'd been offered a position leading corporate compliance at a major hospital network, using her understanding of fraud to prevent it. As the evening drew to a close, the family gathered for a photo. Sullivan with both his daughters, Sarah Harper with her children, Mason with his new family, all connected by love that had grown from the most unlikely beginnings. "You know what I learned," Tommy said, looking at the people who had fought so hard to save his life. "Sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead us to the best parts of ourselves." The city lights twinkled below as Mason and Ava shared their last dance of the evening. "Ready for our next chapter?" he asked. Ava smiled, thinking of all that lay ahead: their work at the center, their blended family, their shared mission to make healthcare better. "With you? Always." Above them, a shooting star streaked across the sky, as if Grace herself were offering one final blessing to the family that had grown from loss, lessons, and love. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. What resonated with you most? Was it the journey of redemption, the power of family bonds, or the triumph of truth over corruption? Support our storytelling team by subscribing to our channel and stay updated on more compelling narratives that explore the depths of human emotions and relationships. Your subscription enables us to continue crafting stories that inspire, challenge, and connect us all. Share this video with friends and family who might find hope and healing in this tale of love, forgiveness, and second chances. Every share helps spread these important messages further. Don't forget to hit the like button if you enjoyed this story. Your feedback means the world to us and helps shape our future content. Thank you for being part of our storytelling journey. We look forward to hearing from you in the comments section below.